The secret to sleeping warm in cold medieval castles was never a single trick, nor a magical solution. It was, rather, a long collection of ordinary habits and quiet customs. These habits, when repeated night after night, carried men and women through winters that seemed to stretch endlessly. To understand how such sleep was possible, we must first step carefully into the quiet rhythm of life inside the cold stone walls of a medieval castle. A castle was not built for comfort. It was not raised to be gentle or cozy, nor was it designed with the thought of soft pillows and warm evenings. A castle was built for survival. Its walls were thick, sometimes 10 feet or more, and they were made of gray stone that seemed to drink in the cold during the day and breathe it back out into the night. Unlike wood, which warms and bends, stone holds on to coldness with a persistence that makes every touch feel sharp. The longer the night lasted, the deeper that cold seemed to sink. As the day began to fade, the castle itself appeared to change. The orange light of the late sun would touch the outer walls, stretching long shadows across the courtyard, and then vanish into the western hills. When the last of the daylight was gone, the dark was not quick to be chased away. There were no switches, no sudden lamps to brighten the hall. Instead, servants moved slowly with torches, one by one, bringing faint pools of light into the darkening chambers. Each flame flickered and wavered against the high walls, casting shadows that seemed too large for the small rooms. Within these chambers, the cold did not wait. The air shifted through arrow slits and narrow windows, carrying with it the sharp sting of the outside. The halls echoed with the faint whistle of the wind. No matter how many fires were lit, the stone remained stubborn. It gave back little warmth. Even tapestries, hung carefully across the walls, could only soften the breath of the night air. These woven hangings, often rich with color and imagery, served less as decoration and more as a shield against the steady chill. Families who could afford them covered every wall they could. Families who could not endured with bare stone that wept with cold. On the floors, rushes were scattered. These were reeds or straw, sometimes replaced after months, sometimes after weeks. In wealthier halls, they were mixed with herbs to create a faint sweetness. On the surface, they seemed simple, but they mattered. They softened the hardness of the stone floors, muffled the endless echo of steps, and trapped some of the cold air that crept beneath the doors. When the fires dimmed and the halls emptied, the smell of rushes, dried and old, lingered as a reminder of the daily life that passed above them. Those spoken of as luxuries were not what we might imagine today. They were wooden frames, some small, some large, some carved with care, others plain. Ropes were tied across the frames to hold mattresses. Those ropes had to be pulled tight, or else the sleeper would sink into sagging discomfort. This is where the saying, "sleep tight," may have its origin. On top of the ropes lay mattresses filled with straw, or with wool, or with feathers, if the family could afford them. Each layer spoke of wealth and position. Straw for the poor, wool for those in between, feathers for the rich. Upon these mattresses came blankets, quilts, and furs. They were not thin. They were heavy, sometimes oppressively heavy, yet necessary. Without weight, the cold would creep in too quickly. Servants often carried heated stones wrapped in cloth to place at the foot of the beds. These stones, warmed in the fire, glowed faintly in the darkness, their heat seeping through the covers just enough to soften the first moments of lying down. The stones cooled quickly, but their presence made the icy bed seem almost merciful before slipping under the covers. People layered themselves in clothes. They wore woolen nightshirts, long and simple. Some pulled on socks or mittens. Many wore caps, for the head was most exposed to the night air. It was not unusual to sleep fully dressed, not for luxury, but for survival. Comfort, as we think of it, was rare. Endurance was common. The evening followed a rhythm that was not rushed. Fires burned in the great hall, their flames lighting the stone arches above. People lingered by the hearths, warming their hands, drinking, talking. Yet, when the hour grew late, each one carried the cold with them as they left. The sound of footsteps on stone faded. Doors closed. Silence spread slowly across the castle. In that silence, the castle itself seemed to breathe. The wind pressed against shutters. The fire in the hearth cracked once, then again, before sinking into a long whisper of smoke. Shadows thickened in the corners. The bed, piled with furs, waited in the dark. The sleeper approached not with the thought of comfort, but with the steady knowledge that sleep was necessary. The body, tired from work or travel, accepted the cold as part of life. This was the true secret. It was not merely blankets or fires, though they mattered. It was not only tapestries or rushes, though they played their part. The secret was patience, repetition, and expectation. People knew what the night would be like, and by knowing, they endured it. The mind, prepared for hardship, allowed the body to drift. A slow breath, a slow silence, a slow surrender. In this way, the heavy night carried them toward rest. Thus, the first step in understanding how medieval people slept warm is not to imagine luxury, but to imagine endurance. Within stone walls, beneath heavy quilts, beside faintly glowing hearths, they made a ritual of preparation. Night after night, season after season, these small rituals softened the edge of the cold. They did not banish it. They did not escape it. They lived within it, and in doing so, they learned how to sleep. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not found in the moment of sleep itself, but in the long and careful preparation that came before. Nightfall did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, like a tide rising against the shore. As the last glow of daylight disappeared behind distant hills, the people of the castle began their steady rituals. Every sound, every task, every small movement was part of a routine that repeated itself across countless winters. To imagine this preparation, picture the courtyard of the castle as the light faded. The torches along the walls were lit one by one, their flames swaying in the breeze. Servants moved with deliberate slowness, carrying buckets of water, stacks of firewood, and bundles of rushes. The smell of smoke drifted from the kitchens, mixing with the sharp bite of the cold evening air. The stones beneath the feet were hard, and their chill seemed to rise through shoes and boots, reminding everyone that the night ahead would be harsh. Inside the chambers, the first step was to tend to the fire. The hearth was not merely decoration. It was the very heart of the room. Without it, the chamber was unbearable. Servants laid logs carefully, arranging them so that the flames might last into the deeper hours of the night. Sparks lifted upward, clinging briefly to the smoke before vanishing. The sound of the crackling fire was both comfort and necessity. It told the sleeper that warmth was near, if only for a little while. Next came the floors. Rushes, old and dry, were scattered or replaced. In wealthier rooms, herbs such as lavender, mint, or thyme were added to create a faint scent that softened the stale odor of smoke and damp stone. These layers absorbed dirt, muffled footsteps, and gave the room an earthy smell that was strangely calming. In the long silence of winter nights, even this simple task mattered. The walls were checked. Tapestries hung heavy and low, covering bare stone. They were woven thick, their colors faded in places, but their purpose remained the same: to block the creeping draft that slithered in from every crack. Without these hangings, the walls would seem to breathe cold air endlessly into the room. With them, the cold was slowed, though never fully stopped. Beds were prepared with equal care. The ropes were tightened across the wooden frame, pulled until firm. A loose rope meant a restless night. The mattress, filled with straw or feathers, depending on fortune, was shaken and arranged. On top of this lay blankets of wool, quilts of linen, and furs collected over generations. Each layer was folded back, ready for the sleeper to crawl beneath at the foot of the bed. Servants placed warmed stones. These were not magical stones, only ordinary rocks heated in the fire, then wrapped in cloth so they would not burn the skin. Yet, for those first cold minutes, they gave the illusion of warmth. Their heat did not last through the night, but it made the difference between shivering immediately and finding comfort enough to drift into sleep. The people themselves also prepared. They did not undress fully as we might today. Instead, they added layers. Woolen nightshirts, long and loose, were pulled on. Some wore socks, others wore mittens. Nearly all wore caps, for heat escaped most easily from the head. Children were bundled tightly, wrapped almost like parcels in the arms of their mothers. In some rooms, entire families shared beds, their bodies pressed close together. It was not always a matter of love or closeness. It was survival. Food and drink also played a role. A warm meal before bed was considered a blessing. Broths, stews, or thick breads filled the stomach and gave the body some strength to endure the night. Ale or warm milk soothed the throat, and though these comforts were simple, they were deeply valued. Hunger and cold together made for a cruel night. Warmth in the belly gave at least the promise of easier sleep. As the hour grew late, the castle grew quieter. The great hall emptied, voices faded, and only the faint shuffle of servants remained. Doors closed one by one. The night was long, but the preparation stretched it out even further. Every action was slow. Every step was measured. It was not rushed, because rushing would change nothing. The cold could not be banished. It could only be delayed, softened, or endured. And so, with all these tasks complete, the chamber was finally ready. The hearth glowed faintly, its fire sinking lower but steady. The rushes softened the stone. The tapestries hung heavy against the walls. The bed stood ready, with blankets piled high, warmed at its foot by stones. The sleeper, wrapped in layers, approached not with excitement, but with quiet acceptance. They knew the cold would come. They knew the air would sting. But they also knew they had prepared, and in preparation there was comfort. It was in this long, repetitive ritual that the true secret was hidden. The routine itself became soothing. The gathering of wood, the shaking of the mattress, the placing of the stones, the layering of clothes, all these tasks lulled the mind into a rhythm so steady, so ordinary, that the body surrendered without struggle. Sleep arrived not as a gift, but as the final step in an endless series of small, careful acts. And so the night began. The wind pressed against the castle walls. The fire whispered in the hearth. The furs weighed heavy upon the bed. And the sleeper, patient and layered, drifted slowly, almost reluctantly, into the quiet of slumber. The secret to sleeping warm in cold medieval castles was not found only in the bed, nor only in the fire. It was also found in the still, heavy cloth that hung upon the walls. These were the tapestries, the woven shields of fabric, the silent guardians that stood between the sleeper and the breath of the stone. To imagine the sleep of a medieval night, one must understand how the walls themselves seemed alive, and how the cloth upon them became a kind of armor against the endless chill. The walls of a castle were not like the walls of a wooden house or a cottage. They were massive, gray, and heavy, often many feet thick. They stood as fortresses against enemies, but also as barriers against comfort. In summer, they trapped coolness, and in winter, they trapped cold. Touching them was like touching ice. Even when a fire burned all day, the stones remained stubborn, holding their frost as if proud of it. The people who lived within these walls knew that no fire could truly conquer the stone. At best, warmth was borrowed, never owned, and so the tapestries were hung. They were woven from wool, from linen, from threads dyed in colors that once glowed brightly, but in time grew dull with smoke and age. They showed scenes of hunts, of battles, of saints, of flowers, and sometimes only patterns of geometry. To the eye, they were decoration. To the body, they were protection. They covered the stone, they muffled the echoes, and they slowed the drafts that slipped like fingers into every gap. Imagine a chamber without them, the walls bare, the stone uncovered, the air creeping in endlessly. The sleeper would shiver, no matter how many furs were piled upon the bed. The cold would not only touch the skin, but sink into the bones. But with tapestries, there was a softness, not a warmth, not truly, but a softness, a barrier, a slowing of the inevitable. The walls seemed less alive with frost, less determined to press the chill into every corner. The tapestries also gave comfort to the mind. A chamber without them felt empty, echoing, hollow. A chamber with them felt closer, smaller, more human. The woven cloth absorbed the sounds of the night. The whistle of the wind grew muffled. The crack of the fire grew softer. Even the footsteps of a servant grew less sharp. This quieting effect, though subtle, made the room feel less hostile. A mind that is calmer, quieter, and less startled is a mind that can surrender more easily to sleep. The making of a tapestry was slow work. Hands worked for months, sometimes years, weaving threads together, pulling color into pattern. Each knot, each line, was a piece of labor and time. When the tapestry was finally hung upon the wall, it was not merely decoration, but a testament to patience, and that patience echoed into the night. The sleeper beneath it, lying in bed, felt the weight not only of blankets, but of effort. Effort that stretched across days, across seasons. This weight of time itself lulled the body into rest in winter. When frost clung to the windows and the moonlight made the snow outside shine pale and white, the tapestries seemed even more necessary. Without them, the castle felt like a prison of ice. With them, it felt just bearable. The fire in the hearth, the blankets on the bed, and the cloth on the walls worked together like a slow chorus. They did not sing loudly, they did not conquer the cold, but they made a rhythm of small defenses, each one modest, but together. Enough. Those who slept in such chambers did not rush to bed as we might today. They lingered by the fire, staring at the flames, listening to the silence. The tapestries loomed above them, catching the firelight, their patterns shifting in the glow. A hunter's horse seemed to move. A saint's robe seemed to flicker. Flowers seemed to bloom and fade with the dance of the flame. These slow, endless changes gave the eyes something to rest upon. They were not exciting. They were not thrilling. They were steady, repetitive, and dull. And dullness, when paired with fatigue, leads to sleep. And so, when the time came to lie down, the sleeper pulled back the blankets, crept beneath the weight of furs, and turned their head not toward bare stone, but toward the softness of cloth. They listened not to the sharp whistle of wind against stone, but to the muffled hum of air slowed by fabric. Their last sight before closing their eyes was not the emptiness of gray walls, but the faint, fading shapes of woven scenes. The mind, comforted by these simple differences, released itself. The body followed. This, too, was part of the secret. Not only the bed, not only the fire, but the walls themselves, clothed in patience and cloth. The tapestries gave not warmth exactly, but the suggestion of warmth. And sometimes suggestion is enough. Enough to ease the mind, enough to quiet the body, enough to allow sleep to come within the cold breath of the medieval night. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not found only in beds and blankets, nor in tapestries upon the walls. It was also found in the quiet struggle of fire. Fire was never constant. Fire was never permanent. It lived only as long as it was fed, and so it was tended, guarded, and watched through the long hours of the night. To drift into sleep in such a place, one had to listen to the fire, to accept its rhythm, and to know its limits. The hearth was the heart of the chamber. It stood against the wall, built of stone, blackened with smoke from years upon years of use. During the day, it burned brighter, flames leaping high, logs crackling, sparks snapping. But by the time the evening crept upon the castle, the fire was no longer a blaze. It was a careful glow, reduced but steady, meant not for light, but for endurance. Servants knew the pattern well. They laid the logs with care, choosing wood that burned slowest, oak, if it could be had, ash, if not. Pine was too fast, too bright, gone too quickly. The choice of wood mattered. A poor choice meant the fire would die too soon, leaving the chamber cold before the night was halfway through. A wise choice meant the embers would linger, glowing red even as dawn approached. The fire spoke in sounds as much as in light. It hissed when moisture clung to the wood. It cracked when air rushed through gaps. It sighed when the flames bent low, whispering against the stone. These sounds filled the chamber with a rhythm that was both alive and dull, a rhythm that could calm the mind, as steady and repetitive as the beating of a drum. To listen to the fire was to listen to a lullaby of heat. The light of the fire was soft. It spread in uneven patterns, shifting across the tapestries, touching the beams above, sliding across the blankets on the bed. No part of the chamber was ever fully bright, nor fully dark. Shadows moved like slow dancers upon the walls, bending and swaying, never leaving, never still. A person lying in bed could watch them for long minutes, even hours, their eyes growing heavy as the shapes blurred into nothingness. But the warmth of the fire was never equal. Near the hearth, the air was gentle, almost kind. Farther away, the cold pressed in without mercy. This meant that people often gathered close before bed, lingering in conversation, warming their hands, letting the heat soak into their bodies before retreating to the colder corners of their chambers. For children, the fire was a comfort. For elders, it was a necessity. When the time came to sleep, the fire still mattered. Heated stones, placed within its flames, were carried to beds. Wrapped in cloth, they were slipped beneath blankets, left at the feet, where their glow of warmth remained for an hour or two. It was not much, but it was enough to soften the shock of cold sheets, enough to allow the body to relax more quickly. Without them, sleep came slower, shivering and restless. The fire was not always tended through the night. Sometimes it was left to sink on its own, embers fading slowly into ash. At other times, a servant was ordered to wake and add wood, keeping the flame alive until morning. But even when left untended, the fire carried its heat further than its light. Embers glowed long after flames were gone, breathing warmth into the stones of the hearth, into the rushes on the floor, into the air itself. It was this slow persistence that gave comfort. The people of the castle knew the fire would not last forever. They knew it would fade, as it always did. But they also knew it would linger just enough, give just enough, share just enough, to allow sleep to find them before the cold returned in full. And so they trusted it. They trusted the fire as one trusts a friend who cannot stay the whole night, but stays long enough to matter. The fire gave more than heat. It gave light to ease the fear of darkness. It gave sound to ease the silence of stone. It gave movement to ease the stillness of the night. Each of these gifts was small, each of them temporary, but together they softened the weight of the cold. And so the sleeper, lying in bed, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, listened to the fire's last whispers. They watched the glow dim slowly, from flame to ember, from ember to ash. Their eyes grew heavy, their breath grew slow. The warmth faded, but the memory of warmth lingered. And in that lingering, the body drifted. Sleep came, not quickly, not warmly, but steadily, carried on the back of the fire that fought for a little while against the endless cold of the medieval night. The secret to sleeping warm in cold medieval castles was not only the fire, nor the tapestries, nor the rushes on the floor. It was also the blankets, the quilts, the furs, the sheer weight of coverings that pressed down upon the sleeper until stillness became inescapable. The night was cold, but the weight itself became a comfort, a reminder that the body was shielded from the chill. Layer upon layer, thread upon thread, fur upon fur. Blankets in medieval castles were not light. They were not thin sheets, nor simple covers. They were heavy, woven from wool, lined with linen, stuffed with feathers if one was fortunate. or patched together from scraps if one was not. Their weight mattered. It pinned the sleeper down, made movement slow, made rest inevitable. In a world where heat escaped from every crack, where the walls themselves breathed frost, the only defense was to trap what warmth remained beneath a fortress of cloth. The first layer might be linen, cool against the skin, though it quickly lost its comfort. Upon this was laid wool, thick and coarse, its texture rough, but its warmth steady. On top of that came furs, wolf, bear, fox, sheep, whatever the household had managed to collect over years of hunting and trade. The smell of the fur lingered, earthy and sharp, but it was a small price for the heat it provided. The more fortunate slept beneath layers so thick they could hardly turn. The less fortunate made do with whatever scraps they owned, pressing themselves together for warmth when blankets were too few. The act of lying beneath these coverings was itself a ritual. The sleeper did not slip easily into bed, as one might today. They crawled beneath the layers, slowly, lifting each heavy quilt, arranging each fur, settling with care so that the cold air did not rush in too quickly. Once inside, movement was avoided. Every shift risked letting in a draft. Stillness was a strategy. Stillness was survival. The weight of the blankets was not only physical, but psychological. To feel covered, to feel pressed down, was to feel secure. The mind, anxious of the cold, anxious of the silence, found reassurance in the pressure of layers. The body beneath them felt less exposed, less fragile, less alone. And so the blanket served not only to hold warmth, but to hold the mind in quiet. The silence of the medieval night was deeper than modern silence. There were no machines, no distant hum of traffic, no far-off voices carried by wires. There was only the faint moan of wind through cracks, the distant cry of an owl, the rare groan of timber as it shifted in the cold. Within the bedchamber, sound grew smaller still. The fire dimmed, the rushes muffled every sound, the tapestries absorbed the whispers of the night. Even the creak of wood seemed hushed beneath the weight of cloth, and so the only sound that remained was the slow rhythm of breath. The sleeper inhaled, the sleeper exhaled. Each breath warmed the small space beneath the furs, creating a pocket of air that grew softer, warmer, safer as the hours passed. The sound of breathing was not only a sign of life, but a sign of peace. In its rhythm, time became distant. Families sometimes shared this space. Children pressed against parents, brothers against sisters, servants against masters, depending on need and circumstance. The warmth of bodies was a resource, and it was not wasted. In these moments, blankets and quilts were not only coverings, but bonds. They tied people together in stillness, in silence, in shared survival. The night, long and cold, was endured as a collective act. The texture of the blankets added to the experience. Wool itched against skin, a reminder of its rough weave. Fur pressed heavily against shoulders, its smell lingering. Feathers, if present, shifted slightly as one turned. All of these sensations built a cocoon of distraction, a tapestry of touch that was both irritating and comforting. Over time, the irritation dulled, and what remained was only the weight, the constant downward pull that quieted the body into surrender. Stillness was the rule of the night. Once beneath the layers, a person avoided moving. To turn over was to risk breaking the fragile barrier of warmth. To stretch was to risk letting in the draft. And so the sleeper remained still, limbs heavy, body quiet, mind slowly drifting. In the stillness, thoughts became slower, softer, quieter. The weight of the blankets pressed not only upon the body, but upon the mind, flattening restless worries into shallow, sleepy repetitions. The cold beyond the blankets never vanished. It was always there, pressing like an invisible presence just outside the layers. But beneath the furs, it could be forgotten. Forgotten long enough for sleep to come. Forgotten long enough for the body to surrender to slowness. Forgotten long enough for morning to arrive. The true secret of these coverings was not that they banished the cold, for they never could. The cold was always there, pressing at the edges, waiting for the fire to die, for the breath to grow thin. The secret was that the blankets made the body forget. Forget how sharp the air was. Forget how endless the night seemed. Forget how hard the stone walls stood around them. Beneath the weight of furs and quilts, forgetfulness became sleep. And so, within the stone walls of the castle, with the fire sinking low, with the tapestries heavy against the walls, with the rushes scattered across the floor, with the heated stone cooling slowly at the foot of the bed, the sleeper lay beneath layers of cloth, their eyes closed, their breath deepened, their body stilled. The night pressed on, long and cold, but the blankets pressed harder. The silence grew heavier, and in that wait, in that silence, sleep arrived. Morning did not break suddenly. The fire had long died, the embers turned to ash. The blankets, heavy as ever, still pressed upon the sleeper, their weight unchanged, their warmth diminished but not gone. The body stirred slowly, unwilling to rise, unwilling to leave the cocoon. The cold beyond the layers was still there, waiting. But for a moment longer, the sleeper remained, trapped in warmth, trapped in silence, trapped in the comfort of the medieval bed. This was the final secret, not only how to sleep warm in a cold castle, but how to delay the return to cold, to linger beneath the covers, to linger beneath the weight, to linger in the silence before day began again. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not found only inside the bedchamber. It was also hidden in the long corridors, in the very stones that surrounded the sleeper. The castle itself was not made for comfort. It was made for defense. Its walls were thick, its ceilings high, its corridors narrow and endless. Every stone held the night's chill. Every passage echoed with silence. To live and to sleep within such walls was to accept the cold as part of life. Walking the corridors before bed was a reminder of the chill that pressed on every surface. The stones were hard beneath one's feet. Even when covered with rushes, the air was still and sharp, flowing in drafts from hidden cracks and arrow slits. Torches burned here and there, but their flames offered little warmth. They cast light, yes, but the warmth never lingered. The farther one walked, the more the cold settled into the bones. The corridors were long, sometimes winding, sometimes climbing, sometimes sinking downward into shadow. They led from hall to chamber, from stair to stair, winding like veins through the castle's body. At night, they were quiet, the echo of footsteps bouncing from wall to wall. Servants moved along them with hushed steps, carrying buckets of hot water, armfuls of wood, or bundles of cloth. Their work prepared the chambers for sleep. Without them, the cold would be harsher still. Each corridor told its own story. Some were wide, where lords and ladies might walk during the day. Others were narrow, hidden passages meant for servants alone. In both, the cold lingered. In both, the stones gave nothing. To pass through them before bed was to be reminded of the battle that sleep would bring. The body longed for warmth, but the castle offered only chill. The walls absorbed everything. They absorbed the laughter of the hall, the warmth of the fire, the voices of men. By the time night arrived, what remained was silence and stone. A person walking alone at night might hear only the sound of their own breath, their own footsteps, the beating of their own heart. This emptiness pressed against them, making them hurry to reach their chamber, to reach the bed where coverings and fire might soften the chill. The corridors were not lifeless. Sometimes a torch flickered, as if stirred by a hidden draft. Sometimes a tapestry stirred when the air slipped behind it. Sometimes the faint scurry of a mouse echoed, or the cry of a bird outside slipped in through a crack. These sounds were small, but in the silence of the night they seemed louder, stronger, sharper. For those walking to bed, they were reminders of the world outside the warmth of coverings. Smells drifted too. Damp air clung to stone in the lower halls, carrying the faint scent of mold and wet rushes. Higher corridors held the smell of smoke, drifting from chimneys and hearths. Sometimes the scent of food lingered, half faded from the evening feast. Sometimes the air was clean, sharp, smelling of nothing but frost. Each smell told the walker something about where they were in the castle, about what lay behind the next turn or stare. The draft was constant. It slipped under doors, through arrow slits, through cracks in the stones. It touched the skin of anyone who walked, a finger of cold that could not be avoided. To walk the corridor was to walk through invisible rivers of air, each colder than the last. Cloaks and hoods helped, but they never kept out everything. The cold found its way in, always. Yet, in their coldness, the corridors offered something that aided sleep. They made the contrast sharper. The cold stone, the empty air, the vast silence, all made the bed feel warmer, heavier, safer once reached. To pass through discomfort was to appreciate comfort. To feel the cold of the walls was to treasure the heat of the blankets. The castle itself was a teacher of gratitude. Children hurried through these halls at night, clutching each other, whispering, trying to ignore the shadows that bent and stretched along the walls. Servants moved slowly, accustomed to the chill, carrying their loads with steady hands. Lords and ladies, wrapped in cloaks, allowed their footsteps to echo as they made their way from hall to chamber. Each step through the corridor was part of the nightly ritual, part of the slow preparation for rest. The stones themselves seemed alive at times. They sweated with moisture in damp seasons. They groaned as frost pressed into their cracks. They swallowed heat in the day and exhaled cold at night. Every sleeper within the castle carried this knowledge. They did not expect warmth from the walls. They expected only endurance. The torches flickered, their flames bending whenever air slipped past. The light shifted and changed, painting the walls with restless shadows. These shadows moved across the length of the corridor, stretching and shrinking, never still. To look at them too long was to imagine movement that was not there. Figures walking, shapes bending. For a tired mind, they became another lullaby, repetitive and slow, a rhythm of shadow upon stone. Even silence was not empty. It was filled with faint echoes, small noises repeated and softened until they became part of the background. A cough from a distant chamber, the clatter of wood set down by a servant, the creak of a door closing. Each sound arrived, softened by stone, stretched thin, faded into quiet. This constant layering of faint noises lulled the listener into stillness. When the chamber door finally closed, when the corridor was left behind, the sleeper felt the difference at once. The chamber, though still cold, seemed warmer by comparison. The fire's glow seemed brighter. The blankets seemed heavier. The silence seemed softer. In this way, the corridors of cold stone played their part in sleep. They made the bed into a refuge. They made stillness into a gift. For in the medieval night, sleep was not only the act of closing one's eyes, it was the act of forgetting the stone, forgetting the corridors, forgetting the endless cold of the walls. It was the act of sinking, at last, into coverings that held warmth, into silence that held peace, into stillness that held dreams. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only about blankets or fires. It was also about the doors, the wooden barriers that separated the cold corridors from the colder night beyond. The doors were simple, sometimes plain, sometimes carved, but always heavy. They stood between the sleeper and the endless chill of the stone passageways. They were not only doors, they were shields, meant to guard warmth and silence, meant to keep out drafts, meant to make sleep possible. Every chamber door told a different story. Some were tall, reinforced with iron bands, creaking on heavy hinges. Others were smaller, less impressive, but no less important. The wood was thick, often oak or elm, chosen for its strength. Over years, the surface grew scarred, worn smooth where hands touched, rough where nails had split. They bore the marks of time, and they bore the marks of cold. The door was closed each night with care. Servants knew to pull it tight, to push against the wood until the latch clicked into place. Some doors were secured with a wooden beam laid across brackets, some with iron locks, others with nothing more than a simple bolt. Whatever the method, the act was the same. To close the door was to hold back the corridor, to hold back the night, to hold back the endless stream of drafts. But no door was perfect. The wind still found ways to enter. It slipped beneath the bottom, a thin, invisible finger of air brushing across the floor. It crept through the cracks at the sides, whistling softly when the gusts outside grew stronger. It pressed against the wood, bending it slightly, reminding the sleepers that the cold was never far away. The door was a barrier, but it was never absolute. The sound of the door was part of the night. The hinges groaned when opened. The latch clicked when closed. Sometimes the wind rattled it gently, shaking it in its frame. To a tired sleeper, these sounds became part of the rhythm of the night. They were repeated, predictable, almost soothing. The mind learned to accept them as background, as steady companions to the silence. Doors were often covered to strengthen them. Heavy curtains were hung across them, woven from wool, sometimes lined with fur. These curtains were not for decoration alone. They were defenses. They stopped some of the draft, softened some of the sound, thickened the barrier between chamber and corridor. In wealthy households, these curtains were embroidered, showing patterns of flowers, animals, or holy figures. In poorer ones, they were plain, patched, made from whatever fabric was at hand. But whether rich or poor, the curtain was another layer of warmth, another blanket, not for the bed, but for the room itself. The doors stood watch while the sleepers lay still. Beyond them, the corridors remained vast and silent, filled with faint echoes and flickering torchlight. Beyond them, stairs wound up into towers or down into cellars. Beyond them, the night pressed harder, the wind colder, the stone darker. To close the door was to shrink the world, to make it smaller, safer, quieter inside the chamber. With the door shut, sleep became possible. The warmth of the fire lingered, the weight of blankets pressed down, the silence of the night deepened. The mind, no longer distracted by the vast corridors, could sink into stillness. The body, no longer brushed by endless drafts, could sink into warmth. The chamber door turned the castle from a fortress of stone into a chamber of sleep. Children often watched the door as they fell asleep. They saw the torchlight slip beneath it, glowing faintly at the floor. They heard the occasional footsteps of servants passing in the corridor. They listened for the sound of the latch, checking that it was secure. In their minds, the door was a guardian, keeping them safe not only from cold, but from anything unknown that might wander the dark. The door also reminded sleepers of distance. Behind it lay the vastness of the castle, the emptiness of halls and towers. Behind it lay the night, stretching far beyond the walls. To close, it was to separate oneself from that distance. Too close, it was to retreat into a smaller, more manageable world. This shrinking of space was soothing, a preparation for the shrinking of thought that sleep required. And so the chamber door was more than wood, more than iron, more than a latch. It was part of the nightly ritual. It was pulled shut as the fire dimmed. It was covered with curtains as the bed was prepared. It was checked one last time before the blankets were lifted. Each of these actions was slow, deliberate, repetitive. Each was a signal to the body and the mind. The night is contained. The cold is pushed back. The chamber is ready. Still, the sleeper knew the cold was never gone. They knew the drafts would return. They knew the wind would rattle the wood. But for the hours between dusk and dawn, the door offered the illusion of separation, and that illusion was enough. Enough to let the mind rest, enough to let the body grow still, enough to allow sleep to come. Thus, when the eyes closed, when the breath deepened, when the body sank beneath the weight of blankets, the door remained behind, silent and still. It stood as the last defense, the last boundary, the last barrier between the sleeper and the endless night of stone. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was never simple. No matter how thick the blankets, no matter how heavy the curtains, no matter how strong the doors, the cold always pressed in. The stone never forgot the night. It absorbed chill. It released frost. It breathed drafts through cracks unseen. Yet, against this endless cold, people had one true companion: fire. The fire was both comfort and necessity. Without it, the bed was not enough. Without it, the chamber was a hollow box of stone, silent and merciless. But with fire, the room became something else. Not truly warm, not truly safe, but softer, gentler, bearable. The fire was a friend to every sleeper, a light in the darkness, a heartbeat in the silence. The fireplace was usually large, set deep into the wall, wide enough that a person could step inside if they wished. The stones around it were blackened with years of soot, marked with smoke that climbed upward into the chimney. Some chimneys worked well, carrying the smoke away. Others did not, filling the chamber with a haze that clung to tapestries, to clothing, to skin. Yet, even when the smoke was harsh, even when it burned the eyes, people welcomed it, for it meant warmth. The fire began long before the night. Servants carried wood up steep stairways, their arms heavy, their feet careful on the worn steps. The wood had been gathered days before, cut from forests, stacked in piles, dried under cover. Each log was chosen with care. Some burned hot and fast, others burned slow and steady. Together, they made the fire last through the night. In the evening, the hearth was laid. Kindling was arranged carefully, twigs and chips stacked in small pyramids. A spark was struck, a flame coaxed into life, breath blowing gently until it caught. Then the wood was added, one piece, then another, until the fire glowed steady, until it crackled and hissed, until the chamber filled with its light. The sound of the fire was as important as its heat. It snapped, it popped, it sighed. These sounds repeated endlessly, soft rhythms that lulled the listener into calm. The smell, too, was constant, the sharpness of burning wood, the faint sweetness of smoke, the dryness of heated air. Together, sound and smell became part of the chamber's lullaby. The fire did not warm evenly. Close to the hearth, the air grew almost hot, drying the skin, reddening the cheeks. But a few steps away, the cold returned, drifting down from high ceilings, creeping in from the walls. The fire fought hard, but the castle always fought harder. In the end, warmth was patchy, uneven, fragile. This was why the bed was placed carefully. It was drawn closer to the hearth, near enough to feel its heat. Curtains around the bed trapped the warmth, creating a pocket of heat within the larger cold. The fire gave strength to this pocket, feeding it hour by hour until sleep came. Servants returned throughout the night. They carried more wood, stirred the embers, added new logs. Their footsteps were soft, their movements practiced. Sometimes they came when the sleepers barely stirred, half awake, half dreaming. The fire was never left alone. If it died, the cold would win. If it burned too high, sparks might leap into tapestries, into straw, into disaster. The servants' watchful care was as important as the blankets themselves. In winter, the fire never seemed enough. The walls still breathed frost. The floors still ached with chill. But the fire gave at least a center, a focus, a promise of warmth. Families gathered close to it before bed, holding out their hands, warming their faces, letting the glow sink into their skin. When they finally moved to the bed, they carried that warmth with them, like a memory, like a blessing. The fire was not always wood alone. In some castles, peat was burned, dug from the earth, dried into blocks. It smelled different, heavier, more bitter, but it lasted, and it gave heat. In other places, charcoal was used, glowing red, without flames, steady through the night. Each fuel had its own rhythm, its own sound, its own life. Each became part of the nightly battle against the cold. The fireplace also gave light, and this light was softer than torches, steadier than candles. It flickered, yes, but it filled the chamber with a golden glow that made shadows dance on walls and ceilings. These shadows were slow, repetitive, weaving patterns that eyes grew used to, patterns that lulled minds toward dreams. Still, the fire demanded respect. It could be friend, but also danger. Sparks could leap and burn cloth. Smoke could choke if the chimney was blocked. Ashes could smolder long after flames died. Every castle knew stories of fire, both saving and destroying. Sleepers trusted it, but they never forgot its power. And so, as the night deepened, the fire burned lower. Logs became embers, embers became ash. The glow dimmed, the sounds softened, the warmth weakened. Yet, even in its fading, the fire played its part. The gentle decline of its light mirrored the gentle decline of wakefulness. As the fire sank, so too did the mind. As the fire dimmed, so too did the eyes. The last glow of embers was often the last sight before dreams. For in the medieval castle, sleep was never simple. It was always a negotiation, always a balance between cold and warmth, between silence and sound, between stone and fire. The fire was not perfect. It did not erase the cold, but it fought always. It fought in crackles and in glows, in smoke and in heat. And because it fought, people could rest. The sleeper knew, as they lay beneath heavy blankets, that the fire still burned. They knew its light still touched the chamber, its warmth still pressed gently against the air. They knew it was alive, steady, constant. And with this knowledge, their minds grew still, their bodies grew calm, their breathing grew deep. The fire, imperfect but faithful, carried them into sleep. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in the fire, nor only in the chamber doors, nor in the stone corridors that led to the bed. It was also in the bed itself, more precisely in the coverings that were laid upon it. For in a castle where the air was always cold, where the stones breathed chill, where drafts wandered freely, it was the blankets that gave the final defense. To lie beneath these coverings was to feel not only warmth, but also weight. The heaviness of blankets was not accidental. It was intentional. Layer upon layer was added until the sleeper felt the press of fabric, wool, and fur. This pressure gave comfort. It reminded the body that it was enclosed, that it was guarded, that it was shielded from the vastness of the night. The first layer was often linen, smooth, pale, sometimes rough, sometimes fine. Linen sheets touched the skin directly. They were washed when possible, though washing was rare, for labor was heavy and water scarce. But even when coarse, linen was softer than wool. It was the foundation, the surface between body and blanket. Over linen came wool, woven in heavy patterns, thick and strong. Wool held warmth better than any other cloth. It smelled faintly of the sheep from which it came, earthy and natural. The weave was tight, the surface scratchy to some, comforting to others. In winter, wool was not one layer but many. Blanket upon blanket was stacked until the weight pressed downward, pinning the sleeper in stillness. Beyond wool came furs. In wealthier chambers, these furs were fox, bear, or wolf. In humbler ones, rabbit or sheepskin. The fur added softness, but more importantly, it trapped air. Air held between hairs became warmth. A fur blanket was not only comfort, it was survival. To draw it close was to build a shield of nature itself. Some beds held feather-filled quilts. These were lighter, but they insulated well. The feathers shifted inside, moving as the sleeper turned, rustling softly in the stillness. Such quilts were precious, costly, often reserved for nobles. Yet, whether quilt or fur, the purpose was the same: to gather warmth and hold it close through the long hours of night. Servants prepared these coverings each evening. They shook them out, laid them flat, smoothed their surfaces, and folded edges carefully. In cold seasons, they added more. In warmer months, fewer, but always there was weight. Always there was layering. Always the bed was made into a nest. To lie beneath these coverings was to surrender. The body sank into the mattress, into straw or feather, and then was pressed from above by wool and fur. Movement grew slower. Limbs grew still. The weight encouraged silence, discouraged restlessness. It was a gentle command to sleep. The sound of blankets shifting was part of the night's rhythm. The rustle of linen, the soft creak of wool, the faint whisper of fur brushing against itself. These were small sounds, yet in the still chamber they were magnified. To a tired mind they became soothing. Repetition made them lullabies. Blankets also carried scent. Wool held the smell of sheep and smoke. Fur held the faint musk of the animal. Linen carried the scent of washing herbs, when such herbs were used. Together, these smells marked the bed, for in the medieval night, safety was as valuable as warmth. The weight of blankets did more than warm the body. It calmed the mind. The heaviness reminded the sleeper of boundaries, of limits, of enclosure. Beneath layers of cloth, the vastness of the castle seemed smaller. The endless night seemed distant. The cold seemed less sharp. The mind, surrounded and enclosed, could finally turn inward, away from corridors and fires, toward dreams. Sometimes the coverings were too heavy. A child might struggle beneath them, shifting restlessly, trying to find air. Yet even then, the layers were not removed. The cold was stronger than discomfort. Better to be pressed by weight than touched by frost. Better to be pinned by wool than left bare to drafts. Sleep, once it came, overcame the heaviness, and the body accepted what the mind resisted in winter. Blankets grew stiff with frost where breath met fabric. The edges near the sleeper's face froze lightly, becoming crisp in the night air. Yet beneath, warmth remained. The contrast between frozen edge and heated core reminded the sleeper of the protection they held. Without the coverings, the frost would have claimed more than linen. The stillness of night deepened beneath the weight. Breath slowed. Limbs rested. Blankets absorbed sound, muffling small noises, softening the chamber's silence. The fire's crackle grew distant. The wind's whistle at the door faded. What remained was heaviness, warmth, and the slow rhythm of sleep. To awaken briefly in the night was to feel the contrast anew. The cold of the chamber pressed at the face, the nose, the ears. But beneath, the body was wrapped, pressed, enclosed. To pull the coverings closer was instinct. To hide the face beneath fur was instinct. And then, with the weight holding firm, sleep returned. The blankets were not luxury alone. They were memory. Will carried the work of shepherds, the labor of spinners, the effort of weavers. Fur carried the hunt, the skill of trappers, the gift of animals. Linen carried the fields of flax, the hands that spun it, the washing that refreshed it. Every layer held stories, and those stories wrapped the sleeper as surely as the cloth did. Thus, the bed became a world within a world. The castle remained vast, cold, and endless. But within the bed, under blankets, there was enclosure. There was boundary. There was warmth. And in this warmth, the body yielded. In this stillness, the mind released. In this weight, sleep took hold. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in fire or in blankets. It was also in silence. The silence of the night, the silence of the walls, the silence that filled every corridor and every chamber. This silence was not empty. It was heavy, layered, alive with echoes that moved so slowly they seemed like breathing. To lie in bed at night was to be wrapped not only in wool and fur, but in stillness, in quiet, in a silence that was as much a covering as any blanket. Silence in a castle was never total, yet it felt endless. The walls of stone swallowed sound. They stretched it, delayed it, softened it. A footstep in a corridor became a faint echo that lingered long after the step was gone. The shutting of a door became a low thud that seemed to drift down passageways. Even whispers seemed to travel, stretched thin, repeated faintly. These sounds, so far away, became part of the silence itself during the day. The castle was noisy voices in the hall, the clatter of dishes, the calls of servants, the barking of dogs. But when the fires dimmed and doors closed, those noises withdrew. The silence arrived like a tide, slow but certain, filling every space, every corner, every stair. To those lying beneath blankets, this silence was a shield. It pressed close, wrapping around the chamber, muffling the vastness beyond dot. Sometimes silence carried the wind. The wind slipped through arrow slits, whistling faintly, low and steady, like a breath that never ended. Sometimes it carried animals, the hoot of an owl outside, the bark of a dog far away, the scurry of mice in the rushes. These were not intrusions. They were part of the rhythm. They came, they passed, they faded. Then silence returned, stronger for their brief visit. The silence was deepened by stillness. Servants stopped their steps. Fires burned lower. Doors closed and latched. The castle itself seemed to rest, its great stones heavy and unmoving. In this stillness, the silence grew thicker. It felt like a second skin, covering the sleepers as completely as blankets did. Children sometimes feared this silence. They listened to echoes and imagined footsteps where none were. They stared at shadows and thought they moved. The mind, when left with too much quiet, yet even fear could turn into rhythm. The imagined footsteps never arrived. The shadows never approached. And in time, the silence proved itself harmless, steady, constant. Fear yielded to rest. The silence was not without meaning. It told sleepers that the day was ended. No more commands, no more labor, no more voices. It told them the world had grown smaller, reduced to chamber, fire, and bed. This shrinking of the world mirrored the shrinking of thought, the drawing inward that sleep required. To sink into silence was to sink into rest. Servants felt it too. When they finished their duties, when wood was stacked, fires tended, doors checked, they too surrendered to the silence. They lay down on pallets, wrapped in wool, and let the stillness carry them. Lords and ladies, heavier in blankets, felt the same. The silence did not distinguish between high and low. It pressed evenly on all. A blanket stretched across the castle entire. The castle walls made silence deeper. Outside, the wind howled. Outside, dogs barked, men called, horses stamped. But within, the stone thickened the air, dulled the sharpness of sound, made it slower, softer. It was not the silence of a meadow or a forest. It was the silence of stone, vast, patient, unyielding. At times, the silence was broken. A door creaked. A log cracked in the fire. A cough escaped from a bed. These breaks did not weaken the silence. They strengthened it. Each sound was absorbed, swallowed, returned to quiet. The silence did not fight interruptions. It accepted them, surrounded them, made them small. To sleep within such silence was to feel contained. The blankets pressed from above. The silence pressed from all sides. The body was enclosed. The mind was enclosed. There was no need to listen farther, no need to reach outward. The silence told the sleeper, remain still, remain warm, remain here. Dreams rose easily from such quiet. The mind, released from sound, drifted inward. The silence outside echoed the silence within. Breathing slowed. Thoughts grew faint. The castle and the sleeper mirrored each other, both heavy, both still, both wrapped in endless quiet. The silence also carried memory. Every sleeper knew that in times of danger, the night would not be so still. Alarms would sound, voices would shout, horns would blow. But tonight, there was none of that. The silence told them that all was safe, that no threat pressed against the walls, that no enemy stirred beyond the gate. This knowledge was as warming as fire, as comforting as fur. In winter, the silence grew sharper, clearer. Cold air carried sound farther, but stone carried it slower. The result was a stillness that seemed eternal. To those lying awake, it stretched without end. To those drifting toward sleep, it carried them gently, softly, like a long, slow river. And so the silence was part of the nightly ritual. The fire dimmed, the blankets pressed, the door closed, and silence filled the rest. It wrapped the castle. It wrapped the sleepers. It became a covering beyond cloth, beyond fur, beyond fire. It became the last layer of the night. Thus, when the eyes closed and breath deepened, silence was the last companion. It was not empty. It was not frightening. It was simply there, vast and constant, steady as stone, soft as wool, endless as night. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in the fire, the blankets, or the silence. It was also in the hands of those who prepared the night. Before the lord or the lady lay down, before the children closed their eyes, before the hallways sank into stillness, there were the servants. Their quiet labor shaped the rest of others. Their steps, their tasks, their small movements formed the unseen ritual of preparing the castle for sleep. The work of the servants began long before the last word was spoken in the hall. As the evening meal ended, they cleared dishes, gathered scraps, and swept the rushes from the floor. The sound of clattering plates faded, replaced by the softer sound of sweeping bristles. These tasks were not only for time, they were for rest. The hall must be quiet, the chambers ordered, before sleep could arrive. Disorder meant discomfort. Disorder meant distraction. Servants removed both, leaving calm behind. When the eating was done and the fires in the hall burned low, the servants turned toward the chambers. Each chamber had its own needs. In the chamber of the Lord, wood was carried. Logs were stacked beside the hearth. The fire was tended, its embers stirred. New flame coaxed into life. The fire must not die too soon, or the chill would seep in. Servants knew how to balance flame and ember, how to give enough wood to last, but not so much that smoke filled the air. The beds were the next concern. Sheets of linen were stretched and smoothed. Blankets were shaken out, their folds spread wide. Furs were placed on top, their weight tested by hand. The bed must feel heavy, but not stifling. Too little covering meant cold. Too much meant restlessness. Servants had learned, through long habit, what each sleeper preferred. One lord wanted more furs. Another wanted lighter wool. Each request was remembered. Each bed was prepared in silence, save for the rustle of cloth and the faint thump of fur laid down. Water was brought as well. A jug of water, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, was placed nearby for washing before sleep. Basins stood ready, and towels of linen lay folded. For the higher-born scents of herbs were sometimes mixed in the water, lavender, sage, or rosemary, to ease the senses, to soften the mind. For the common, plain water sufficed. Yet whether scented or plain, the water was a ritual. To wash before bed was to leave behind the dirt of the day. The body was readied for stillness. Candles were another part of the ritual. Servants lit them carefully, placing them where light was needed. Not too many, for wax was precious. Not too few, for shadows could trouble the mind. A small cluster of flames stood near the bed, their light flickering on stone walls, making shadows dance. For safety, some were snuffed before the master slept, but one or two remained, their soft glow standing guard against complete darkness. The servants themselves moved quietly. Their steps were measured, their voices hushed. They spoke little, for the night had already begun to fall, and the castle demanded quiet. Their silence was part of the ritual. Too much noise would disturb the sense of rest. Too much sound would break the stillness that sleep required. So they worked in near silence, their movements as soft as the folding of cloth, as light as the placing of logs. Security was also part of their task. Doors were checked, bolts slid into place, shutters closed. A castle at night must not only be warm, it must be safe. The servants walked corridors, checked gates, and listened for strange sounds. The closing of doors, the creak of iron bolts, these too became sounds of comfort. They told the sleepers that all was secure, that nothing would disturb their rest. When all was done, the servants withdrew. Some remained nearby, sleeping inside chambers, ready to answer if called. Others returned to their own small rooms, simple pallets of straw, covered with wool. They too sought rest, though their blankets were thinner, their fires smaller. Yet even in their modest sleep, they shared in the same silence, the same stillness, the same night that wrapped the lords above. In truth, the servants were the unseen keepers of warmth. They carried the wood that fed the fire. They smoothed the blankets that gave comfort. They brought the water that cleansed the day. Without them, the castle would have been cold, disordered, uneasy. With them, it became a place of rest. Their labor, hidden and humble, was as important as the fire or the fur. Thus, the secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only stone or wool or flame. It was also the quiet service of hands that prepared the night. They worked when others had ceased. They ordered what others would not see. And when, at last, the master and mistress lay beneath their coverings, it was the servants' work that made rest possible. The night, then, was a shared thing. The silence was shared. The stillness was shared. Even the labor of preparing it was shared, though unequally. And in this sharing, the castle itself became ready for sleep. The walls held the silence. The fires gave their glow. The blankets pressed with weight, and the servants' hands had shaped it all. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in the servants who prepared the chamber. It was also in the small rituals that came before sleep. These were the last acts of the day, the gestures that carried people from waking to rest. They were slow, quiet, repeated night after night. They prepared the body, they prepared the mind, they prepared the soul. Without them, sleep might come restlessly. With them, it arrived like a tide, steady and certain. The first ritual was washing. Water was carried to chambers in jugs of clay, bronze, or wood. Basins were set out, towels folded. Some water was cold, taken straight from wells. Some was warmed by the hearth. Lords and ladies often preferred warm water, mixed with herbs or oils. Rosemary was common, its sharp scent clearing the air. Lavender, when available, was thought to calm the spirit. Sage and chamomile were also used. To dip one's hands into such water was to feel both heat and fragrance, to let the body loosen after the labors of the day. The washing was not a full bath. Such baths were rare. It was a matter of hands, face, perhaps the feet. The dirt of the day was wiped away. Dust, sweat, crumbs, ash, all removed with cloth and water. In winter, the warm water was a comfort. In summer, cool water refreshed. The act itself was unhurried. Each motion was slow, deliberate. The rubbing of hands, the pressing of cloth, the drying with linen, all were small gestures, but they were gestures of release. For common folk, the ritual was simpler. A jug of plain water, often cold, served the purpose. They too washed their hands, their faces, sometimes their feet. The rushes beneath them, the smoke around them, the wool upon them, all these could make the body heavy with dirt. To wash before sleep was to lift some of that heaviness. Even in poverty, even with little, the ritual endured. After washing came prayers. For lords and ladies, prayers were said, kneeling by the bed. For monks, they were sung in quiet chapels, their voices echoing through stone halls. For servants, they were whispered where they lay, on pallets or straw. The words varied, but the pattern was the same. Gratitude for the day, requests for safety in the night, hope for waking at dawn. The castle at night was vulnerable. Fires might die, enemies might attack, illness might strike in sleep, death itself might come silently. Prayers were the shield against these fears. They asked for protection from saints, from angels, from Christ. They asked for warmth, for peace, for dreams free of terror. To pray before bed was to place the night into higher hands, to trust the silence that followed. Children were taught to pray as well. They whispered small verses, guided by mothers, fathers, or nurses. They crossed themselves, folded their hands, closed their eyes. In these small acts, they learned the habit of surrender. Prayer was not only words. It was posture, gesture, stillness. It was the body folding into rest, even as the mind folded into faith. Other rituals joined washing and prayer. Some wore charms about the neck to guard against bad dreams. Some placed sprigs of herbs near the pillow, lavender for peace, rosemary for memory, rue for protection. Some left a candle burning, its light a shield against spirits thought to wander in darkness. Superstition mingled with faith, each adding to the sense of safety. For those of higher rank, servants sometimes read aloud from scripture or from stories. The slow sound of words, the rhythm of a voice, lulled the listener toward sleep. For others, stories were told by kin, tales of saints, tales of ancestors, tales of wonder. These were not only for entertainment, they were part of the slow passage into rest. The mind, distracted by narrative, released its hold on worry. In winter, when nights were long, the rituals stretched. Washing took more time, for the cold water numbed the hands. Prayers were longer, seeking greater protection against the biting air. In summer, the rituals were shorter, for warmth itself seemed protective. But whether long or short, they were constant. They marked the boundary between day and night. The gestures mattered as much as the words. To fold hands was to close the day. To kneel was to humble the body. To extinguish a candle was to surrender to darkness. Each motion carried weight. Each motion taught the mind to slow, to quiet, to let go. When all was done, the water dried, the prayers spoken, the candles dimmed, the bed awaited. The body was clean, the mind calmed, the spirit guarded. The blankets felt heavier, the silence deeper, the fire warmer. The castle itself seemed readied for rest. Thus, the secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in stone, fur, or fire. It was also in ritual. The washing that cleansed, the prayers that guarded, the gestures that stilled. These made the night more than absence. They made it a passage, a transition, a slow descent into rest. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in the fire, the blankets, or the silence. It was also in the light, or rather, in the soft glow that came before darkness. That glow belonged to candles, small, flickering, fragile, and yet steady enough to shape the mood of the night. To lie in a medieval chamber was to see walls, tapestries, and beams washed in amber light. It was to watch shadows move slowly, stretching and shrinking with every breath of flame. Candles were not endless. Wax was precious. Tallow, made from animal fat, was more common, though it gave a smell, a smoke, a heaviness to the air. Beeswax was finer, clearer, cleaner, and reserved for the wealthy or for churches. Whatever the source, a candle was not wasted. It was used with care, lit when needed, snuffed when not. In the chamber of a lord, several candles might burn. In the bed of a servant, perhaps only one. But whether one or many, their light was the same, soft, uneven, alive. To watch a candle was to see motion in stillness. The flame rose, bent, straightened, bent again. It trembled with drafts from doors or arrow slits. It shrank when the wax burned low. Shadows on the wall responded in kind. They grew, they faded, they danced. Tapestries seemed to move, figures shifting as if alive. Carved beams darkened, then brightened, then darkened again. The room was never still. It was alive with flicker. This flicker was part of the passage to sleep. Unlike the bright sun, unlike the clear fire, the candle's light was soft, limited. It did not fill the chamber. It left corners in shadow. It left ceilings dim. It asked the eyes to rest, not to strain. It told the mind that the day was done, that only a little light remained, that darkness was near. Some found comfort in this. The small light was a companion. It meant that the night was not absolute, that there was still warmth, still visibility. Children often asked for a candle left burning to guard against fear. Adults, too, found ease in it, knowing that the light stood as watch. A candle by the bed was like a sentinel, small but constant. Others saw in shadows a source of unease. Shapes shifted. Corners seemed to move. The mind, half-tired, invented forms. A figure in the corner, a hand on the wall, a face behind the curtain. The candle created as much as it revealed. Yet even this unease was part of the rhythm. The mind faced its fears in shadow. Then, slowly, as eyelids grew heavy, the fears dissolved. Shadows no longer moved. The flame dimmed, the mind yielded, and sleep arrived. The ritual of candlelight was deliberate. A servant lit them with a taper, moving carefully from one to the next. Wax dripped, sometimes caught in holders, sometimes hardening on wood. The smell of tallow hung in the air, mingling with smoke from the hearth. The glow filled the chamber slowly, like water rising. When enough was lit, the servant withdrew. The master sat, prayed, or washed in that soft light. Later, the candles were snuffed. This, too, was ritual. A tool, often a cone of metal, was placed over the flame. Smoke curled upward, a faint thread. Darkness spread, swallowing corners, then walls, then floors. One candle, perhaps two, was left, placed near the bed. They burned lower as the night advanced, their light shrinking with each hour. In time, even they would vanish, leaving only darkness. For common folk, candlelight was rarer. A single stub of tallow might be all they had. They used it sparingly, perhaps for washing, perhaps for prayer. Many went to sleep in near darkness, guided only by firelight or by the moon. Yet, even a single candle carried meaning. It was not only light, it was a sign of order, of ritual, of transition. To light it was to say, the day is ending. To snuff it was to say, the night has begun. The castle itself seemed to breathe with candlelight. Corridors glowed faintly, torches dimming, candles flickering. Great halls darkened, their vastness swallowed by shadow. Chambers grew smaller, more intimate, reduced to the circle of light around a flame. The world contracted with every candle that was snuffed. Sleep approached not only the body, but the castle itself. The shadows played their part. They softened the hard lines of stone. They covered imperfections, cracks, and stains. They turned walls into moving screens, alive with motion. They gave the mind something to follow, something slow, something repetitive. Watching shadows was like watching waves or listening to wind. It lulled the mind, distracted it from worry, guided it toward rest. And when the candle burned low, the ritual reached its end. Wax pooled, wick shortened, flame sputtered. The last flicker sent one final dance across the walls. Then smoke rose, thin and curling. Darkness reclaimed the room. The sleeper was left with silence, with warmth, with blankets, with rest. Thus, the secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in wool or fire. It was also in light, in the candle that glowed, in the shadows that moved, in the slow dimming of the world. The candle prepared the eyes, the shadows prepared the mind, and the snuffing of the flame prepared the soul. And so the castle slept, not in sudden darkness, but in a slow descent, guided by the shadows of candlelight. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in servants, washing, prayers, or candlelight. It was also in the way hours passed, slowly, steadily, almost without sound. Night was long in the medieval world, without clocks that ticked loudly, without lamps that shone brightly, without distractions that pulled the mind. The hours stretched wide. They passed like water, flowing in darkness, unseen, unmeasured, but felt. To sleep in a castle was to rest within these hours, to drift with their rhythm, to surrender to their length. The measurement of time was different then. Bells rang in chapels or towers, marking the hours of prayer. Matins in the middle of night, lauds at dawn, compline at dusk. These were the signs by which people knew the hours. But within chambers, there were no bells. There were only breaths, only flickers of fire, only the fading of candles. To lie in bed was to feel time, not as numbers, but as silence that deepened, as shadows that grew, as warmth that thickened under blankets. For nobles, time sometimes came in the sound of servant steps, a log added to the fire, a shutter adjusted against the wind. For commoners, time was measured by the body, the stiffening of limbs, the heaviness of eyelids, the slow turning in straw. The hours were not rushed. They were wide and patient. They invited rest. Sleep itself was not a single block. It came in segments. People often woke in the middle of the night, stirred by cold, by silence, by habit. This waking was not feared. It was expected. They prayed, they spoke quietly, they tended the fire. Then they returned to bed, wrapping themselves again in wool and fur. The hours of wakefulness were as much a part of rest. The night was not broken by them. It was shaped by them. In winter, the hours were longer. Darkness fell early, lingered late. Fires burned for many hours, wood consumed steadily. The sound of logs cracking marked the passage of time. Sparks rose, faded, rose again. Each hour was like a log, placed, burned, consumed, leaving behind only embers. In summer, the hours were shorter, but still they stretched, unbroken by noise, unbroken by haste. The castle itself seemed to keep the time. Its stones cooled slowly, its air grew still. The sounds of outside dogs, wind, owls came at intervals, like markers of hours. A dog barked, then silence. Later, the wind whistled, then silence. Still later, a mouse scratched in the rushes, then silence. Each sound told the sleeper that another part of the night had passed. The slow passing of hours gave weight to dreams. Sleep came, broke, came again. Dreams rose, faded, returned. They stretched across the night like banners, loose and flowing. The sleeper might wake, remember, turn, and sleep again. The night was not one dream, but many, joined by silence. A low tolling, faint but steady, came through stone and wood. It marked midnight prayers. It reminded sleepers of the world beyond their beds. For monks, the bell was a command: rise, pray, return. For nobles, it was a distant murmur, sometimes heeded, sometimes ignored. For servants, it was background, folded into their rest. Time was felt also in the body. Breathing slowed, deepened. Hearts beat steady. Limbs stiffened under weight. The longer the hours, the heavier the body felt. But this heaviness was comfort, not burden. It was proof of stillness, proof of surrender. Each hour pressed more firmly, guiding the body deeper into rest. There was no hurry. No clock struck to demand rising. No bell chimed to demand labor, except at dawn. The hours were allowed to pass slowly, freely. Sleep was allowed to stretch, to pause, to begin again. The castle, with its silence, its warmth, its weight, held the hours like water in a basin. They did not rush out. They stayed, surrounding the sleepers, and so the secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in fire or fur. It was also in time itself, in hours that passed slowly, in rhythms that guided the body, in silence that measured the night. To surrender to these hours was to surrender to rest. And when dawn came at last, faint light seeping through shutters, roosters calling in the yard, bells ringing in the chapel, the long night ended. The hours had passed, the body had rested, the castle woke. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in servants, or in washing, or in candlelight, or in the slow passage of hours. It was also in dreams. To close the eyes in a chamber of stone, to sink under wool and fur, to listen as silence pressed close. This was to enter a second world. The castle gave warmth to the body, but dreams gave warmth to the mind. They were not always pleasant. They were not always gentle. Yet they were constant, nightly companions, shaping rest as surely as blankets did. Dreams were not seen as meaningless. They were messages, signs, omens. To dream of water was to think of cleansing or of danger. To dream of fire was to think of passion or of warning. To dream of flight was to think of escape, of freedom. Each dream carried weight. Lords might call for interpreters. Monks might record them. Servants might whisper them to one another in the morning rush. Dreams lingered, their meaning sought, their power feared. The stone walls of the castle seemed to hold dreams as they held silence. Shadows lingered, even in sleep. The smell of smoke, the press of fur, the faint creak of wood, all these slipped into dreams. A crack in the fire became a thunder in the mind. A draft at the shutter became a ghost at the door. The real world fed the imagined one, and the sleeper moved between them without boundary. Some dreams were comforting. A mother dreamed of her child safe. A soldier dreamed of victory. A servant dreamed of rest without labor. These dreams eased the night, made the hours lighter, carried the sleeper toward peace. Other dreams were heavy. The weight of stone pressed even in sleep. Narrow corridors became endless passages. Towers stretched higher and higher, unreachable at their top. Shadows deepened into figures that would not move. These dreams carried fear, but even fear was part of rest. To face it in dreams was to wake stronger, calmer, relieved that it was only shadow. Superstition grew around dreams. Herbs were placed near pillows to shape them. Lavender was thought to bring peace. Rue was thought to ward off nightmares. Rosemary was thought to preserve memory. Charms were worn to keep dark visions away. Prayer was spoken not only for waking safety, but for sleeping safety, protection from terrors of the night. For monks, dreams were watched carefully. They might be visions, messages from God, temptations from the devil. To see an angel was to hope. To see darkness was to beware. Their writings tell of nights filled with battles, voices, signs. They did not dismiss them. They recorded them, studied them, treated them as serious. For nobles, dreams were sometimes guidance. Kings had dreams before battles, before decisions. Their interpreters spoke of outcomes, of warnings. A single dream could weigh as heavily as counsel from advisors. Within stone walls, where silence was deep and hours long, such dreams felt even stronger. For servants, dreams were whispers. They dreamed of food, of family, of escape. Their straw beds, their thin blankets, their weary bodies gave them dreams of abundance. To wake was to return to labor. Yet the dreams carried them through, gave them moments of comfort, gave them visions that made the night easier. The act of dreaming itself was a rhythm. Sleep came, dreams rose, the body stirred, sleep returned, dreams shifted. The night was not one dream, but many. They came and went like guests through a corridor. Some stayed long, some passed quickly. All left traces. In winter, dreams seemed deeper. The weight of blankets pressed harder. The silence grew thicker. The fire dimmed lower. The mind turned inward more strongly. The darkness outside was total, and within that darkness, the imagination expanded. Dreams grew larger, stranger, fuller. In summer, with shorter nights, dreams were briefer, lighter, but still they came. Dreams were also shared. In the morning, families spoke of them. Children told of visions of animals, of play. Adults spoke of warnings, of signs. Sometimes they laughed at them, sometimes they feared them. Servants whispered them to each other as they swept halls. Monks recorded them in texts. Dreams moved beyond the bed into the waking day. Thus, the secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in wool or fire, not only in silence or ritual, but in the life of dreams. They carried the sleeper beyond the stone, beyond the cold, beyond the weight. They gave meaning to the hours. They gave comfort, or fear, or hope. And when morning came, when shutters were opened and light returned, they lingered still, soft as shadows, heavy as stone. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in furs, fires, or dreams. It was also in the walls themselves. Castles were not thin houses of wood. They were massive, layered, built from stone so thick that even sound was swallowed by them. To step inside such walls was to step into silence, into weight, into permanence. These walls stood against enemies, but they also stood against cold. Not perfectly, not completely, but steadily, with hidden warmth. Stone is cold when touched. To place a hand upon it is to feel chill, as though the wall itself is made of winter. Yet stone has another nature. It holds what is given to it. Heat that seeps into stone stays longer than in wood. Fires lit in chambers did not warm the walls quickly, but once warmed, the walls kept that warmth through the hours of night. While wind howled outside, the stone released its quiet heat, slow and steady, like breath. The thickness of the walls mattered most. Some were as thick as a man is tall. Within such thickness, cold could not travel quickly. The breath of the sleepers, the life of the chamber. Between those two faces lay a weight that slowed the cold, that blunted it, that forced it to wait. The stone became a shield, not only for swords, but for sleep. Windows were rare in lower chambers. Where they existed, they were narrow slits, designed for arrows more than for light. These narrow slits let little air in, and what little came was slowed by shutters. Behind shutters, tapestries or curtains often hung, their fabrics softening the draft. Thus, the walls, though stone, worked with wood and cloth to keep the inside warmer. The great halls were larger, harder to heat. Fires roared in their hearths, but the stones swallowed much of the flame's gift. Still, by the time the hall quieted, by the time benches were empty and torches dimmed, the walls had gathered enough warmth to give back slowly, hour by hour, to those who slept near, especially those of lords and ladies. Fires were kept alive longer. Servants tended them until late, adding logs, stirring embers. The walls drank in the heat. When the fire dimmed at last, the stone began its slow exhalation. To lie against a wall was cold, but to lie near one was comfort, for the warmth drifted unseen, soft but steady. The walls also gave a different kind of warmth, the warmth of safety. Cold was feared, but invasion was feared more. To sleep under stone was to sleep under protection. The body rested more deeply, knowing that arrows could not pierce, that swords could not break, that storm could not enter. This safety itself was warmth, though unseen, though unfelt by the skin. The mind calmed, the heart slowed, sleep deepened. The stones themselves had stories. They had been lifted by hands, set with mortar, shaped by labor. Each carried weight, not only of earth, but of history. The walls were old even in their own time, often built upon older ruins, layered with centuries. To sleep within them was to share in their endurance. As the stones had survived winters past, so they would survive this one, and so would the sleepers inside. Yet the cold was never fully banished. Even the thickest walls could not stop it entirely. Drafts crept through cracks. Frost formed upon inner faces. Breath clouded in the air. Blankets were still needed, fires still fed, but the walls slowed the battle. They gave time, they gave pause. They were allies in the fight against winter. Some chambers were built deep within the walls themselves, in spaces called mural chambers. These rooms, hidden in the thickness, were small, narrow, sometimes windowless. They were warmer than larger spaces, for the cold outside was held back by the sheer bulk of stone. To sleep in such a chamber was to be surrounded on all sides, wrapped in stone, as in a second blanket at night. When winds rose and snow pressed against the castle, the walls groaned softly. The sound was not frightening, but steady, like wood settling, like earth shifting. To hear it was to be reminded of the wall's presence, of its labor in holding the storm at bay. Sleepers turned in their beds, pulled blankets tighter, and trusted the stone to keep the world outside. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle began with the walls, cold to the touch, yet steady in their gift of warmth, harsh in appearance, yet soft in their slow exhalation of heat. They stood through the night as silent guardians, holding back cold, holding in comfort, allowing those within to close their eyes, to rest, to dream. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in thick stone walls. It was also in the way people dealt with the openings in those walls, the windows, the shutters, and the coverings of heavy cloth called tapestries. These details may seem small, but they mattered greatly, for it is often through small openings, to rest well, to sleep without shivering. These openings had to be managed with care. Medieval castle windows were not like modern glass panes. Most were narrow, thin, and vertical. They were made less for looking out and more for defense. Arrows could be fired through them, but wide drafts could also slip through. In the day, these slits allowed some light, though never much. At night, they became channels for cold air, letting the chill of the outside seep into the room. Shutters were the first defense. Made of wood, often thick and heavy, they were fitted inside the window openings. By day, they could be opened to let light and air. By night, they were closed, bolted, sealed. To close the shutter was to close out the world. The sound of it, the weight of wood against stone, gave comfort. It meant the cold was kept back, at least for a while. Yet wood alone was not enough. Small cracks still let drafts slip through. To answer this, tapestries were hung. These were not only decorations, they were tools. A tapestry was a great piece of cloth, woven thick, sometimes with designs, sometimes plain. Hung against walls, they softened the feel of stone. Hung over shutters, they softened the feel of cold. The fabric absorbed the air that crept in, trapped it, stilled it, kept it from spreading in noble chambers. The tapestries were grand. They showed hunting scenes, battles, saints, and stories. But behind their beauty lay their greater purpose, warmth. To sit near a wall hung with tapestry was far warmer than to sit near bare stone. To sleep in a bed surrounded by cloth hangings was far warmer than to sleep in the open. Nobles valued beauty, yes, but they valued comfort as well. Servants did not always have such hangings. Their windows were smaller, their shutters simpler, their coverings rougher. Yet even rough cloth, even old furs, even bundled rushes stuffed in cracks, all these helped. Every layer slowed the cold. Every barrier made the night easier. The way shutters and tapestries worked together mattered. A shutter closed first, strong against wind. Then a cloth hung, soft against drafts. The two combined, wood and fabric, hard and soft, solid and yielding, formed a wall within a wall. In this way, the castle defended not only with stone, but with care, with craft, with layers. The placement of beds also showed thought. Few would sleep pressed directly against a window. Beds were pulled back, placed in warmer corners, often against inner walls. Nobles had canopies with curtains of heavy cloth that surrounded the bed itself, creating a small room within the room. Inside this canopy, warmth gathered and drafts were kept out. The castle within a castle, the wall within a wall, the bed within the chamber. All these layers kept the sleeper warm. At night, the sound of shutters mattered too. Wind struck them, rattled them, tested them. To hear them hold was to feel safe. To hear them creak was to know they resisted. Sleepers drifted off to such sounds, comforted by the thought that the outside storm was stopped at the shutter. Sometimes shutters were lined or reinforced. Cloth, fur, or even leather might be pressed against them. The goal was always the same: to thicken the barrier, to slow the cold. And if no tapestry was large enough, smaller cloths were hung together, patchwork against the night. The castle was not careless. It made use of what it had. In great halls, tapestries covered vast stretches of stone. They told stories, yes, but they also softened echoes, held warmth, gave the hall a gentler feel. Without them, sound was harsh, air was sharp, comfort was little. With them, the hall became more human, more bearable. Lords might boast of their tapestry's beauty, but servants knew their deeper value. Thus windows, shutters, and tapestries were not small details, but central parts of sleeping warm. They kept out wind. They softened drafts. They layered protection. Without them, even the thickest walls could not keep a chamber warm. With them, even a small fire, even a few furs, even a weary body could find rest. The secret lay in layers: stone, wood, cloth. Each did its part. Together they formed a shield. And within that shield, the sleeper closed his eyes, breathed slowly, drifted into the long night, safe from the cold outside. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in thick stone walls, it was also in the way people dealt with the openings in those walls, the windows, the shutters, and the coverings of heavy cloth called tapestries. These details may seem small, but they mattered greatly, for it is often through small openings that the cold creeps in, to rest well, to sleep without shivering. These openings had to be managed with care. Medieval castle windows were not like modern glass panes. Most were narrow, thin, and vertical. They were made less for looking out and more for defense. Arrows could be fired through them, but wide drafts could also slip through. In the day, these slits allowed some light, though never much. At night, they became channels for cold air, letting the chill of the outside seep into the room. Shutters were the first defense. Made of wood, often thick and heavy, they were fitted inside the window openings. By day, they could be opened to let light and air. By night, they were closed, bolted, sealed. To close the shutter was to close out the world. The sound of it, the weight of wood against stone, gave comfort. It meant the cold was kept back, at least for a while. Yet wood alone was not enough. Small cracks still let drafts slip through. To answer this, tapestries were hung. These were not only decorations, they were tools. A tapestry was a great piece of cloth, woven thick, sometimes with designs, sometimes plain, hung against walls. They softened the feel of stone. Hung over shutters, they softened the feel of cold. The fabric absorbed the air that crept in, trapped it, stilled it, kept it from spreading in noble chambers. The tapestries were grand. They showed hunting scenes, battles, saints, and stories. But behind their beauty lay their greater purpose: warmth. To sit near a wall hung with tapestry was far warmer than to sit near bare stone. To sleep in a bed surrounded by cloth hangings was far warmer than to sleep in the open. Nobles valued beauty, yes, but they valued comfort as well. Servants did not always have such hangings. Their windows were smaller, their shutters simpler, their coverings rougher. Yet even rough cloth, even old furs, even bundled rushes stuffed in cracks, all these helped. Every layer slowed the cold. Every barrier made the night easier. The way shutters and tapestries worked together mattered. A shutter closed first, strong against wind. Then a cloth hung soft against drafts. The two combined, wood and fabric, hard and soft, solid and yielding, formed a wall within a wall. In this way, the castle defended, not only with stone, but with care, with craft, with layers. The placement of beds also showed thought. Few would sleep pressed directly against a window. Beds were pulled back, placed in warmer corners, often against inner walls. Nobles had canopies with curtains of heavy cloth that surrounded the bed itself, creating a small room within the room. Inside this canopy, warmth gathered and drafts were kept out. The castle within a castle, the wall within a wall, the bed within the chamber. All these layers kept the sleeper warm. At night, the sound of shutters mattered too. Wind struck them, rattled them, tested them. To hear them hold was to feel safe. To hear them creak was to know they resisted. Sleepers drifted off to such sounds, comforted by the thought that the outside storm was stopped at the shutter. Sometimes shutters were lined or reinforced. Cloth, fur, or even leather might be pressed against them. The goal was always the same: to thicken the barrier, to slow the cold. And if no tapestry was large enough, smaller cloths were hung together, patchwork against the night. The castle was not careless. It made use of what it had. In great halls, tapestries covered vast stretches of stone. They told stories, yes, but they also softened echoes, held warmth, gave the hall a gentler feel. Without them, sound was harsh, air was sharp, comfort was little. With them, the hall became more human, more bearable. Lords might boast of their tapestry's beauty, but servants knew their deeper value. Thus, windows, shutters, and tapestries were not small details, but central parts of sleeping warm. They kept out wind. They softened drafts. They layered protection. Without them, even the thickest walls could not keep a chamber warm. With them, even a small fire, even a few furs, even a weary body could find rest. The secret lay in layers: stone, wood, cloth. Each did its part. Together they formed a shield, and within that shield, the sleeper closed his eyes, breathed slowly, drifted into the long night, safe from the cold outside. The secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle was not only in its walls, windows, shutters, and tapestries. It was also in the floors beneath the feet. For warmth does not only vanish through open air, it sinks downward, into the ground, into stone, into the cold earth. To sleep well in a castle chamber, one had to think not only of the walls around, but of the floor below. Castle floors were often made of stone. Strong, durable, unyielding, stone supported weight and lasted centuries. But stone was also cold. In winter, the chill of stone rose upward, spreading into chambers. A bare floor was harsh, unfriendly, biting. To walk barefoot was to feel winter in each step. To sleep upon it was worse. Something had to be done. The answer was coverings. Rushes, reeds, straw, cloth, and skins were spread upon the floors. These were not luxuries. They were necessities. They created a layer between body and stone, a barrier against cold. They softened hardness, muffled sound, trapped warmth. In great halls, rushes were laid thick. Servants brought bundles of them, fresh from riverbanks or meadows. They spread them across the stone, sometimes mixed with herbs for scent. These herbs, lavender, thyme, rosemary, added fragrance, but they also carried meaning. Their presence made the hall not only softer, but sweeter. Lords and ladies walked upon them, feasted upon them, even slept upon them when gatherings stretched into night. But rushes were more than decoration. They caught dirt, scraps, and ashes. They absorbed spills and soot, and they gave some warmth, however slight. Without them, the hall would echo with cold, hard footsteps. With them, sound dulled, warmth lingered, comfort grew in private chambers. Floors were cared for more carefully. Carpets were rare, precious, and imported. Only the richest could afford them. Yet even without carpets, furs and cloths were spread. Animal skins, laid near beds, softened steps. Woolen mats absorbed chill. Layer upon layer, the cold was slowed. For servants, the floor was often their bed. Straw piled in corners, covered with old cloth or blankets, became sleeping places. Rough though it was, the straw held air, and air held warmth. To burrow into straw was to burrow into insulation. It was scratchy, yes, but it was warmer than stone. Many slept this way, night after night, finding comfort in what little they had. The practice of changing rushes was important. Old rushes gathered dirt, insects, and waste. Fresh rushes were laid to renew the chamber, to keep it healthier, to keep it warmer. This renewal was part of rhythm, part of care. A chamber without rushes was a chamber of stone. A chamber with rushes was a chamber of life. Coverings did not stop at the floor. Beds themselves were raised, lifted from ground or stone. This raising mattered. Heat rises, cold sinks. To sleep higher meant to sleep warmer. Beds of wood, platforms of straw, frames of rope, all lifted the body away from the coldest air. The higher the bed, the warmer the sleep. Some castles even had underfloor heating of a kind, in places influenced by Roman design. Heat from fires below traveled through spaces, under floors, warming stones. This was rare, but where it existed, it made chambers more livable. Still, most relied on simple coverings, on rushes, on straw, on skins. The sight of a chamber floor told much. Bare stone meant poverty, or neglect, or harshness. Covered floors meant care, comfort, and effort against cold. Nobles valued not only the look, but the feel. A richly covered floor spoke of wealth as much as a tapestry did. To visitors, it showed power. To sleepers, it gave warmth at night. When fires dimmed and winds pressed against shutters, the floor coverings held their quiet work. They did not shine, they did not speak, but they insulated. They slowed the loss of warmth. They kept feet from freezing. They made chambers more bearable. Thus, the secret to sleeping warm in a medieval castle lay also beneath the sleeper. Stone might be cold, but straw, rushes, and coverings stood between. They were small, humble, often unnoticed. Yet, without them, sleep would have been far colder, far harsher, far shorter. The castle defended above, around, and below. Walls, shutters, tapestries, and rushes each played a role. Together, they created a place where sleep, though never fully free from cold, could at least be found, could at least be kept. The medieval castle was never simply a pile of stones. To those who built it, lived within it, and slept inside its chambers, the castle was more than structure. It was a body. It was a shelter that breathed, absorbed, whispered, and endured. To rest inside was not only to lie beneath walls, but to become part of a system that worked day and night, winter after winter, century after century, to protect human sleep. The stones were not lifeless. The walls were not empty. The castle, in its own way, lived. The outer walls of the castle were its skin. They stood against the outside world with unwavering strength. Winter winds struck them, frost clung to them, and rain beat upon them, but the walls resisted. Inside, life was different. Still cold, yes, but steadier. The stone absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly by night. Its thickness dulled sudden changes. Within these walls, men and women found continuity. They breathed easier because the skin of the castle stood firm. No matter how harsh the storm outside, the stone wrapped itself around them, holding them close in its vast embrace. Deep inside, fire was the castle's heartbeat. Flames in kitchens, halls, and chambers pulsed like blood. The rhythm of a day was marked by fire, bright in the evening, glowing through midnight, dim at dawn, rekindled at morning. Its warmth was drawn into walls, into floors, into the very bones of the castle. Even when fires burned low, the warmth they had given lingered. The castle carried that pulse in its stones, a silent heartbeat that sleepers felt without knowing. Without fire, the castle was a cold shell. With fire, it was alive. Every chamber was like an organ, serving a purpose. The great hall was the stomach, gathering people, storing energy in feasts and company. Kitchens were the furnace, feeding both stomach and hearth. Bedchambers were the heart's chambers, smaller, closer, designed to hold warmth within narrow limits. Stables added their heat through the breath and bodies of animals. Storerooms preserved supplies against hunger. The whole castle, like a living body, worked to sustain those within. Air moved through the castle like blood through veins. Drafts crept, winds wound their way. Smoke rose through shafts. Some currents cut harshly, chilling the skin of those who walked the halls. But many were slowed by doors, staircases, and arches. Spiral stairways trapped the air, softening its bite. Corridors curved, weakening the speed of drafts. The castle did not seal air completely, but it regulated it, as a body regulates breath at night. When fires dimmed and voices stilled, the castle had its own sounds. Beams groaned as wood shifted. Doors creaked in their frames. The wind sighed through arrow slits. These were not frightening, but familiar. Generations grew used to them. The castle's voice became the lullaby of life inside. To close one's eyes in a chamber was to listen to stone and timber murmur softly. Its constancy gave comfort. The strength of the castle did not lie in a single feature. No single wall, no single fire, no single chamber was enough. The true secret was in unity. Fire warmed stone. Stone released warmth slowly. Tapestries softened air. Narrow chambers trapped heat. Doors and corridors shaped drafts. Each part helped the others. Together, they formed a system that kept sleep possible, even in harshest winter. The castle lived as a whole, not as fragments. The walls were more than physical. They were reassurance. To lie beneath thick arches, to hear the bolts on doors, to know enemies and storms were far beyond. This gave the mind rest. Even if breath still clouded in the cold, the sleeper felt safer. The psychological embrace was as vital as the physical one. Without it, fear would have kept men and women awake. With it, the castle became both blanket and guard. The castle lived because people lived within it. Fires were fed by human hands. Heat was shared by bodies gathered together in halls. Even in bedchambers, servants, lords, and families sometimes slept close, not only for company but for warmth. Their breath thickened the air, their bodies raised the temperature. The castle was not shelter without them. With them, it breathed, pulsed, endured. Year after year, generation after generation, people slept within the same walls. The winters came, harsh and endless. The stones endured, carrying warmth from countless fires. The castle held life long after its builders had turned to dust. In its endurance, it became more than structure. It became memory. Even in ruin, its presence lingers. A broken wall still shows the thickness that once held heat. A fallen tower still suggests the body of a living shelter that once embraced sleepers. Sleep inside was to rest inside a being larger than oneself. The walls were its skin, the fires its heart, the rooms its organs, the corridors its veins, the sounds its voice, and the unity of all its parts its soul. The castle was alive, not in flesh, but in function. It gave warmth, imperfectly, but gave it steadily. And in its embrace, sleep was possible, night after night, winter after winter. Sleep in a medieval castle was not merely a personal act. It was part of the rhythm of community, of survival, of a long winter night stretching from dusk to dawn. When the day ended and the gates were closed, when the torches in the courtyard burned lower and the kitchens finished their final tasks, the castle seemed to change its nature. What had been a place of noise, activity, and labor during daylight became a place of silence, a place of endurance, a place of waiting. The long hours of darkness demanded patience, and patience was learned through habit. For those who lived inside, sleep did not always come easily. The air was heavy with smoke from fires. The chill crept in through cracks in the stone, and the sounds of animals from the stables echoed faintly through the night. Yet, in that imperfect environment, men and women lay down, pulling cloaks around their bodies, whispering prayers, and surrendering to the stillness of night. Sleep was not a luxury. It was a necessity, and it was taken as one more duty of life. The body adjusted in time. Generations who lived in such conditions grew used to the cold. Children were born into drafty rooms, and their first memories were of wool, straw, and the chill of breath in the air. Adults carried those memories into old age. A blanket of wool, a layer of straw beneath, and the warmth of another person nearby made the night tolerable. Sleep did not need softness. It needed endurance. The castle taught this lesson again and again, through every season, until even the harshest frost felt familiar. The silence of the night was never complete. Wind found its way through slits in the wall. A dog barked in the courtyard. A guard's footsteps echoed faintly on the ramparts above. The horses shifted in the stables, their hooves thudding lightly against wooden floors. The castle was alive even at night, and those who lived within its walls knew these sounds by heart. They were not frightening, they were steady. People slept to the rhythm of the castle itself, with its endless breathing, groaning, and whispering. In a strange way, the castle cradled them not by silence, but by constancy. Time seemed to stretch differently at night. The darkness was not broken by electricity or lanterns that burned all hours. Fire was precious, and wood was limited, so flames were allowed to fade. In the slow dimming of the hearth, shadows grew long, then disappeared. People slept in stages, waking briefly in the middle of the night before settling again into drowsiness. Their sleep followed the rhythm of fire and darkness. To sleep in a medieval castle was also to share in its collective warmth. Even those of higher status, who had their own chambers, relied on the work of others to prepare their bedding, light their fires, and keep supplies ready. Servants sometimes slept nearby, not just for duty, but to provide an extra measure of human warmth. In the great hall, lower-ranking members of the household slept side by side on straw pallets, their bodies forming a shield against the night air. Alone, the cold was sharp. Together, it was lessened the mind to found comfort in ritual. Prayers before bed were whispered, not only for the soul, but for peace of sleep. The recitation of familiar words created rhythm, easing the body into stillness. Some clutched charms or small tokens for safety. Others simply closed their eyes, trusting that the thick walls around them were enough. What mattered most was the sense of enclosure. The vastness of night outside the walls was unknowable. Inside, the limits of stone gave people a boundary that let them rest dreams. In such a place must have been colored by cold and silence. Imagine lying on a straw bed, the faint glow of embers on the hearth painting the ceiling with light. Imagine the draft creeping at your feet and the sound of a horse breathing in the stable below. Sleep came not with comfort, but with surrender. To sleep was to accept the world as it was, harsh yet familiar, restless yet secure. It is important to remember that these nights were long. In winter, darkness lasted more than half the day. People did not fill all those hours with sleep, but much of it was spent in lying still, conserving warmth, drifting in and out of slumber. The bed was not simply a place to rest, but a refuge, a cocoon against the freezing air. A blanket might be thin, but a blanket plus another body, plus the walls of the chamber, plus the fire that had burned earlier, combined into a system of survival. Some slept in layers of clothing, keeping boots or cloaks close at hand. The cold was so much a part of life that preparing for bed did not mean undressing, but adding protection. In wealthier households, fur was used, but even fur was not endless. Much of the population depended on wool, rough but warm. Beneath them, straw served as insulation, and though it grew dusty, it was replaced as often as possible to keep the space dry. Even the structure of the castle influenced the pattern of rest. Narrow windows meant the moonlight entered only in slivers. The thickness of stone made sound distant, muffled, as if the world outside was far away. A single wooden door with an iron bolt stood between the sleeper and the cold passage beyond. The sense of enclosure was complete. It was not silence that comforted, but the barrier itself. To sleep inside a castle was to rest inside layers of defense stone, wood, fire, and flesh, and when morning came, the process reversed. Fires were rekindled, straw was shaken, blankets were folded or hung. Life resumed with the rhythm of chores, of cooking, of tending animals. The night had passed, survival had been achieved, and the castle prepared itself to endure another cycle of day and darkness. For those within its walls, the memory of sleep was not about comfort, but about having made it through, night after night, year after year, generation after generation. People closed their eyes within castles, enduring the cold, finding strength in the repetition of ritual, and sharing in the strange companionship of stone walls and flickering fire. They survived not by escaping discomfort, but by embracing it. Sleep became less about luxury and more about survival, less about rest and more about acceptance. And in that acceptance, the human spirit endured. When the night stretched across the land and the castle settled into its slow rhythm of rest, not everyone within its walls found the same kind of sleep. The castle was divided by rank, by duty, and by space, and each of these divisions shaped the way people closed their eyes and endured the darkness. For the Lord and his family, chambers were set apart, often higher in the towers or deeper within the keep, with thicker walls and stronger doors. For the servants, the soldiers, and the stable hands, rest came in more crowded spaces, closer to the drafts and the noise of animals. The difference was not only in comfort, but in expectation. The Lord's chamber might hold a larger bed, perhaps with a canopy, perhaps with heavy curtains that trapped heat. The mattress might be stuffed with feathers rather than straw. There might even be furs laid across the blankets. Yet even with these advantages, the chamber was still cold by modern standards. The fire burned down, the stone walls exhaled chill, and breath fogged in the air. The privilege was relative. It meant a degree less suffering, not its absence. In the great hall, the experience was far more communal. At the end of feasts or long days of work, benches were moved aside, rushes on the floor were swept, and pallets of straw were laid out in rows. People lay down side by side, sometimes wrapped in their own cloaks, sometimes sharing blankets. The press of bodies created its own warmth, a human furnace that pushed back against the creeping cold. To sleep in the hall was to surrender individuality, to accept the nearness of others, and to blend into the rhythm of the group. For guards, sleep was not whole but broken. Watches were divided, and each man or woman knew their turn to walk the walls, to stare into the darkness beyond the moat, to listen for sounds of danger. Their rest came in intervals, light and uneasy, always with the awareness that they would be shaken awake for duty. In winter, the burden was heavier. The cold cut through armor and cloak, and the relief of returning to a bed, however hard, was profound. The guard's sleep was the sleep of exhaustion, snatched in brief moments before the next watch began. Children in the castle adapted in their own way. They often slept with their families, clustered around parents or older siblings. Their beds were rarely private. Instead, they learned early the comfort of closeness, the rhythm of shared breathing, the security of a familiar body beside them. For them, the castle was not strange but home, and its sounds, the creak of beams, the call of a night bird, the crackle of a dying fire were lullabies that marked their nights as ordinary. The arrangement of sleep reflected not just social order, but necessity. Warmth was a resource to be shared. Those with wealth hoarded more of it, but even the wealthiest could not shut out the nature of stone. Those with little relied on the press of the group, the rhythm of company, the endurance of shared survival. Every layer of the household, from the lord to the lowest servant, submitted to the same cycle of cold nights, long darkness, and patient rest. To lie down in such a world was to be aware of others. The hall filled with the sound of breathing, of coughing, of muttered dreams. Privacy was rare, and the boundaries between one sleeper and another were faint. Yet this closeness created its own form of security. No one was entirely alone in the night. The nearness of others was protection as much as it was inconvenience. A lone sleeper might be colder, more vulnerable, more fearful. A group of sleepers, however restless, formed a circle of safety. The castle itself seemed to guide this arrangement. Its rooms gathered people together. Its thick walls absorbed their warmth. Its narrow passages directed the flow of air. It was not designed for comfort, but it was designed for endurance. To sleep in it was to become part of its function, another figure within its system of survival. And as the hours passed, the castle held them all. The lord in his chamber, wrapped in furs. The servants in the hall, huddled on straw. The guards on their brief beds between watches. The children beside their families. Each part of the household found its place, and together they endured the long night until morning came again. Night after night, this pattern repeated, not once, not twice, but for centuries. The rhythm of shared sleep, of broken rest, of survival in company, became the memory of castles. It was the unspoken secret of their endurance. The walls stood strong, but it was the people inside, sleeping together in their countless ways, who gave the castle its life. The experience of sleep in a medieval castle was shaped not only by the walls and the bedding, but also by the cycle of seasons. Winter brought the harshest nights, when even the thickest stone and the heaviest wool could not keep out the bite of frost. But summer, too, had its own rhythm of rest, when heat built up during the day and lingered in the chambers long into the night. The people of the castle lived according to these cycles, and their sleep was tuned to the world outside as much as to the walls around them in the heart of winter. The act of going to bed was less about comfort and more about strategy. Firewood was limited, so flames were carefully managed. A fire might burn strongly in the evening, but by midnight it would often be reduced to glowing embers. Families and servants alike learned to gather around those last embers, drawing as much warmth as possible before the chill crept back in. Cloaks were pulled tighter, cloisters were filled with the sound of muffled breaths, and sleep became a negotiation with the cold. Summer nights were gentler, but even then, the stone of the castle shaped the experience. Thick walls that had held in warmth during the winter now held in heat. Chambers higher in the towers could feel stifling, their small windows admitting little breeze. People sought relief in shaded corners, or sometimes even in the courtyard when the air was still. Sleep was lighter in summer, interrupted by insects, by sounds of animals stirring late, by the sheer closeness of heavy air. Yet, in its own way, it was just another rhythm, and people adjusted. Autumn and spring provided transitions. In autumn, sleep came earlier as the nights grew longer, and people prepared themselves for the endurance of winter. Straw was gathered, bedding was repaired, and supplies were stored to make the season bearable. In spring, sleep was restless with the activity of renewal. Birds called earlier, animals stirred sooner, and the dampness of thawing earth. Each season demanded its own adjustment, and the castle's inhabitants adapted as naturally as they breathed. The rhythm of night, was also shaped by tasks that never fully ended. In the kitchens, someone remained to tend embers for the morning fire. In the stables, grooms might rise during the night to check on animals. In the Lord's chamber, servants sometimes slept nearby, ready to fetch water or tend the hearth if needed. The castle never entirely slept. It rested in fragments, with some waking while others dreamed. The result was a household always half alert, always half at rest, caught between vigilance and slumber. Those who lay down in the great hall knew this especially well. Dozens of bodies filled the floor, each one with its own rhythm of breathing, turning, coughing, or whispering in the dark. Sleep in such a place was not a deep silence, but a shared experience. The sound of one person shifting might wake another, and the murmur of voices could pass briefly before fading again into snores. Yet, in that constant shifting, there was also reassurance. No one slept alone. No one faced the night in solitude. The dreams of those nights must have been shaped by this closeness. Perhaps they dreamed of warmth when they felt the cold creeping in. Perhaps they dreamed of open fields while lying in stone chambers. Perhaps they dreamed of silence while surrounded by the sounds of 100 breaths. Whatever their dreams, they carried the weight of their surroundings with them. Sleep was not escape, but continuation, another way of being inside the castle's embrace. Time itself felt different in the medieval night. Without clocks to mark the hours, people measured the passage of darkness by the feel of the fire, by the sounds of animals, by the fading or rising of the moon. Some woke naturally in the middle of the night, lying awake for a time before drifting back into slumber. Others broke their sleep to pray, believing that the stillness of midnight was especially suited to devotion. Sleep was not a single block, but a series of passages, a journey through stages of rest and waking. The castle itself reinforced this rhythm. Its walls held the cold or the heat. Its windows admitted faint glimmers of moonlight. Its fires provided the measure of warmth. Every element of the building became part of the sleeper's experience. To live in such a place was to surrender to its nature, to accept that the castle itself decided much about how one slept. And yet, despite the challenges, sleep was always found. The body, weary from labor, from watch, from worry, surrendered eventually, whether on straw in the hall, on furs in a private chamber, or on a bench near the kitchen hearth. People closed their eyes and drifted into the same silence. The castle, for all its hardness, gave them that. It gave them a place to rest, however imperfect, however cold. It gave them continuity, night after night, season after season, century after century. The seasons passed, the centuries turned, and still the memory of that rhythm lingers. In ruins today, when wind whistles through broken towers and moonlight touches crumbling walls, one can imagine the sleepers who once lay within. Their breath clouded the air, their fires glowed briefly in the dark, their dreams drifted through the night. They endured, and their endurance gave the castle its life. The castle at night was not silent, though to those inside it might have seemed so at first. Sleep was a fragile thing, and it lived within an atmosphere full of faint noises, flickering lights, shifting drafts, and unseen presences. To lie down in such a place was to surrender to this world of interruptions, and to accept that the night was never entirely still. The air moved through cracks in shutters. The wind moaned across battlements, and timbers groaned as if remembering the strain of the day. Within this shifting quiet, people closed their eyes, drifted into half-dreams, and found their way into rest. The sound of the hearth was often the last voice heard before sleep. Flames whispered low, coals cracked softly, and sparks flared briefly before dying. These small noises blended with the rhythm of human breathing, with the occasional cough or stir, and together they created the background of the night. In the Lord's chamber, the fire might burn longer, and the sound of logs falling into embers might comfort those within. In the hall, the fire was shared by many, and its fading glow reminded everyone of how fragile warmth truly was. Animals were part of this night world too. Horses shifted in stables, stamping their hooves, blowing out warm breaths that misted in the cold. Dogs stirred near doorways, growling softly in dreams, or barking suddenly at sounds outside the walls. Chickens rustled in their roosts, and rats scurried unseen along beams. These creatures lived beside the people, sharing their rhythms, interrupting their sleep, and yet also protecting them in ways. A bark in the night might warn of intruders. The shift of animals might signal changes in weather. Their presence, for all its noise, was inseparable from the experience of sleeping in a castle. For those lying awake, the night could feel endless. Without clocks, time stretched in ways that were hard to measure. The dark was not only long, but heavy, pressing down on those awake. Some prayed quietly, whispering words into the stillness. Some stared at the ceiling beams, tracing their shapes in the faint firelight. Some shifted position again and again, trying to find comfort against the hardness of straw or the weight of wool. Wakefulness in the medieval night was a common thing, a shared secret. Even if it was rarely spoken of in the day, dreams themselves were considered more than illusions of sleep. Many believed they carried meaning, that they revealed truths hidden in the world. A dream of warmth might be taken as a sign of good fortune. A dream of falling could suggest danger ahead. In the castle, dreams were shared in whispers the next morning, compared and interpreted. Sleep was not only for the body but for the soul, and what happened in dreams mattered. The restless nights of winter, filled with broken rest and many awakenings, brought with them a flood of dreams, each one carrying weight. The rhythm of sleep was also shaped by interruption. Guards moved through the corridors, their footsteps echoing on stone. Bells sometimes rang, marking late prayers or sudden alarms. The call of a watchman on the wall might drift down into chambers, pulling sleepers into half-awareness before they sank back into dreams. These interruptions were part of the castle's life, reminders that safety was always conditional, that even in sleep, one remained connected to duty. To live in a castle was never to be entirely free from responsibility, even at night. Yet there was also comfort in this restless sleep. The castle held its people close, wrapping them in walls of stone that had stood for generations. The sounds of others nearby, the breathing of family, the turning of servants, the distant footsteps of guardsmen, that one was never alone. In a world where dangers lurked outside the walls, the closeness of others was safety. Sleep, broken and imperfect as it was, still carried the promise of protection. The architecture itself shaped every moment. Narrow windows admitted little light, but the moon sometimes found its way in, casting pale silver across beds and floors. High ceilings echoed the faintest noises, turning small sounds into presences larger than they were. Doors creaked, hinges groaned, and drafts moved through hidden cracks. The castle was alive with sound and motion, and sleep came within that living structure, shaped by it, guided by it, never separate from it. Servants often experienced the night differently than lords. For them, sleep was sometimes delayed by chores that stretched late, or broken by tasks required at odd hours. A maid might rise to stoke a fire, a boy might fetch water, a cook might prepare for an early meal. Their rest was often shorter, lighter, interrupted by duty. Yet they, too, found their way to dreams, even if only for a few hours, huddled close in shared spaces, wrapped in worn blankets, finding comfort in proximity rather than luxury. Less burdened by responsibility, slipped into sleep more easily, though they, too, stirred in the cold. They clung to their parents or siblings, seeking warmth and safety in touch. Their dreams were vivid, filled with the sounds and images of the day, shaped by stories told at the hearth or by fears whispered in the dark. Their sleep was less steady, but their recovery was swifter, their bodies more forgiving of straw beds and chill air. The night, with all its interruptions, passed slowly, yet it always passed. Dreams ebbed and flowed, fires died and were reborn. Guards walked their rounds, and sleepers shifted through cycles of rest and waking. By the time dawn touched the horizon, the castle stirred again with new life. Sleep ended, not with silence, but with movement. The sound of doors opening, animals calling for food, fires being rekindled, voices murmuring as people rose. The fragile world of night gave way to the busyness of day, and the memory of restless sleep dissolved into the rhythm of work. And still, the cycle repeated, night after night. The castle's people endured the same conditions, accepted the same interruptions, and surrendered to the same restless dreams. It was not comfort they sought, but endurance. To sleep in a castle was to participate in this endless pattern, to share in the life of the walls, the fires, the voices, and the silences. For centuries, this pattern shaped human lives, and it remains in memory even now. The final hours of the medieval night carried a strange weight. The castle seemed quieter then, not because sound was absent, but because those who stirred did so softly, as if reluctant to disturb what little rest remained. Sleep at this stage was deeper for some and lighter for others. Those who had managed to find warmth and comfort sank into the last stretch of dreams, while others lay half awake, waiting for the faintest glow of dawn to free them from their long vigil against the cold. The night was always longest just before morning, and in castles of stone, that length pressed upon the body and the spirit alike. By this point, the fires in most chambers were nearly gone. In the Lord's chamber, the embers glowed faintly, still giving off some warmth, though much less than before. Curtains around the bed, heavy and lined with furs, trapped what little heat remained. Within that enclosure, the Lord and his family lingered in slumber, protected from the drafts that swept through the rest of the room. Yet even there, the cold made itself known. Noses and ears tingled, breath fogged faintly in the dimness, and the weight of blankets pressed down like armor against the chill. Elsewhere in the castle, fires had burned out almost completely. In the great hall, the last glow from the central hearth shimmered faintly, lighting the shapes of sleepers spread across the floor. Some stirred and shifted, pulling cloaks tighter, while others lay curled in clusters, sharing warmth through the closeness of their bodies. The smell of straw, smoke, and humanity hung heavy in the air. It was not a fresh scent, but it was familiar, and familiarity brought its own form of comfort. Guards at this hour felt the passage of time most sharply. For them, sleep was broken into shifts, and the last watch before dawn was often the hardest. The body longed for rest, yet the eyes were demanded to remain open, scanning the walls, the gates, the dark outlines of fields beyond. The cold of pre-dawn hours was sharpest, cutting through layers of wool and leather. They stamped their feet, blew into their hands, and shifted their weight to keep themselves awake. For them, the promise of sunrise was more than the return of light. It was the return of rest, a chance to close weary eyes at last. Children, huddled beside parents or siblings, often slept soundly through this part of the night. Their small bodies, less disciplined by duty and less burdened by responsibility, gave in fully to dreams. They shifted occasionally, murmured in their sleep, or clutched tighter to whatever blanket or cloak they held. Their innocence shielded them from the discomfort in ways that adults could not easily match. For adults, awareness of the cold and of the duties of the coming day often crept in, waking them before dawn, leaving them restless while children still dreamed. Dreams during these hours carried a different quality. They were heavier, slower, perhaps deeper. Some believed that dreams before dawn held special meaning, that they were closer to truth or prophecy. A knight might dream of battle, a servant of warmth, a mother of her child's future. Whether these dreams were remembered or forgotten, they filled the silence of the castle, a hidden life that pulsed beneath its stone walls. For those awake in these hours, the castle was transformed. Shadows stretched long, flickering faintly as torches burned low in sconces. The silence was deep enough that the smallest sound, an ember collapsing, a rat scurrying, a guard coughing, seemed louder than it truly was. The halls, usually alive with footsteps and voices by day, stood empty. The kitchens, bustling at mealtimes, were still. The stables, usually filled with noise and movement, were quiet but for the occasional stir of an animal. To walk the castle at this hour was to see it at its most vulnerable, its most human. The stone itself seemed colder then, as though the walls had absorbed the chill of the night and pressed it back upon their inhabitants. To touch the surface of a wall was to feel dampness, a kind of living cold that clung to the skin. The floors beneath bare feet were icy, and drafts moved like invisible rivers through corridors and chambers. The castle reminded its people that it was not a warm home but a fortress, one that demanded endurance rather than comfort. And yet, despite this severity, the castle also offered safety. Beyond its walls, the world was darker still. Woods held hidden dangers, roads were lonely and cold, and open fields offered no shelter. The castle, for all its discomfort, stood as protection. Its walls turned away the wind, its gates shut out intruders, its towers kept watch over the land. Those who slept within might wake cold, but they woke alive, preserved by the strength of the stone around them. The approach of dawn was gradual but unmistakable. The air itself seemed to change, growing less heavy, less oppressive. Birds began to stir outside, their faint calls reaching the ears of early risers. The eastern sky shifted from black to gray, and pale light began to slip through narrow windows and cracks in shutters. Sleepers stirred, some rising, some stretching, some pulling blankets tighter for just a little longer. The spell of the night broke, slowly but certainly, as day returned. With morning came work, and so sleep ended, not with ease, but with necessity. Fires were rekindled in kitchens, animals were tended in stables, and servants began their duties. The Lord might remain in bed a little longer, but even he would rise soon enough, called by the rhythm of responsibility. Children woke to the sounds of bustle, rubbing their eyes, pulling on simple clothes, and beginning their part in the day. The castle was alive again, its people pulled from dreams back into labor. The night, with all its struggles, faded into memory. Yet it was not forgotten. Each person carried its weight, its rest, its dreams into the day. The body remembered the cold, the spirit remembered the silence, and the mind remembered the slow drift of hours. Night after night, this memory was repeated, forming the rhythm of life within the castle. To sleep in a medieval castle was not to rest in comfort, but to endure with patience. It was to share warmth with others, to surrender to the rhythm of fire and stone, to live in a world where sleep was fragile but still possible. It was to dream in shadows, to wake in cold, and to rise again with the dawn. For centuries, this pattern shaped the lives of those within, and even in ruins today, the memory of those nights lingers. To imagine those lives is to hear the faint crackle of a dying fire, to see the shapes of bodies curled on straw, to smell the mix of smoke and dampness, to feel the bite of chill air. It is to know that, despite hardship, sleep always came, and in that sleep, the castle was alive, not only in its stones and towers, but in the hearts of those who dreamed within.